Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. Now, let's begin. 2 months into our marriage, my wife Jenna and I stumbled across what seemed like the deal of a lifetime while scrolling through budget travel sites at 3 in the morning. A rustic villa in Tuscany for less than half the usual rate, available for the exact week we needed. The photos showed sun-drenched stone walls covered in climbing jasmine, a pool overlooking endless hills of olive groves, and bedrooms with those gorgeous exposed wooden beams you only see in Italian architecture magazines. The listing came from a small agency called Bella Vista Rentals, and though their website looked pretty basic, the reviews seemed genuine enough. 28 years old and drowning in student loans, we figured we deserved at least one nice thing after our courthouse wedding. So we booked it immediately, sending the deposit through an international wire transfer that took forever to process at the bank. The drive from Florence Airport should have taken 90 minutes according to Google Maps, but we spent almost 4 hours winding through increasingly narrow roads that our rental Fiat barely squeezed through. Each turn took us deeper into the countryside, past abandoned farmhouses with caved-in roofs and fields that hadn't seen cultivation in decades. Jenna kept making jokes about horror movies while filming everything on her phone, but I could tell she was getting nervous when we lost cell signal about an hour from the villa. The property manager, a guy named Giorgio who spoke maybe 10 words of English, met us at a gas station 5 miles away because, according to him, the final stretch was too confusing for foreigners to navigate alone. He drove ahead in a beaten-up Alfa Romeo that belched black smoke, leading us down a dirt road so rough I thought we'd lose our exhaust system before we even arrived. The villa itself was exactly like the photos, which should have been our first real warning sign since nothing on vacation ever matches the advertising. Every detail was perfect, from the antique copper pots hanging in the kitchen to the fresh lavender bundles tied to each bedpost, almost like someone had staged it 5 minutes before we walked in. Giorgio handed us 3 different keys on a heavy brass ring, explaining through gestures and broken phrases that one opened the main door, another the pool house, and the third was for the cellar where they kept extra linens and cleaning supplies. He pointed at his watch and held up 8 fingers, then pointed at the morning sun, which we understood meant he'd check on us at 8 the next day. After he left, Jenna and I explored every inch of the place, marveling at the frescoed ceilings and the clawfoot bathtub big enough for 2 people, both of us giddy with disbelief that we'd scored such an incredible place for basically nothing. That first day passed like a dream sequence from one of those travel shows, where impossibly attractive couples drink wine at golden hour. We cooked pasta with tomatoes from the garden, skinny dipped in the pool under a blanket of stars, and made love on the terrace while crickets provided the soundtrack. Around midnight, exhausted from travel and too much Chianti, we collapsed into the massive 4-poster bed in the master bedroom. The mattress was one of those ancient horsehair things that molded perfectly to your body, and within minutes I was unconscious, not even stirring when Jenna got up to use the bathroom around 2 in the morning. The next thing I knew, sunlight was streaming through the shutters. The church bells from some distant village were ringing 7 times, and the space next to me in bed was cold and empty. At first I figured Jenna had gotten up early to photograph the sunrise, something she always talked about doing but never actually managed, because she hated mornings more than anyone I knew. I called out her name while pulling on yesterday's shorts, checked the bathroom, the kitchen where yesterday's wine glasses still sat unwashed, then walked out to the pool expecting to find her floating on one of those ridiculous flamingo rafts we'd found in the pool house. But the water was perfectly still, reflecting the cypress trees like a mirror, and her camera bag sat untouched on the dresser where she'd left it the night before. I searched every room twice, even checking ridiculous places like inside the armoire and behind the heavy curtains, telling myself she must be playing some elaborate prank, even though Jenna wasn't the type to think scaring people was funny. The villa felt different in the morning light, too quiet, like it was holding its breath. 20 minutes into my increasingly frantic search, I remembered the cellar Giorgio had mentioned. The one we hadn't bothered exploring yesterday because we were too busy living out our Tuscan fantasy. The wooden door was tucked behind the kitchen, painted the same faded green as the shutters, with iron hinges that screamed like a dying cat when I pulled it open. The smell hit me immediately, not the musty wine cellar scent you'd expect, but something chemical and sharp, like industrial bleach mixed with copper. A single bulb dangled from a wire at the bottom of the stone steps, casting these weird dancing shadows that made it hard to see clearly. The floor was bare concrete, and even from the top of the stairs I could make out dark stains spreading in irregular patterns, some old and brown, others fresh enough to still look wet. My brain kept trying to rationalize what I was seeing, maybe wine spills or water damage, but then I noticed the zip ties scattered in the corner, the kind police use for mass arrests, and a pile of women's jewelry tangled together like someone had dumped out a drawer in a hurry. I stumbled back up those stairs so fast I cracked my shin on the stone edge, leaving a gash that bled through my shorts, but I didn't even feel it until later. My phone was dead upstairs, and when I tried to charge it, I realized the power had been cut sometime during the night. The landline in the kitchen, an old rotary thing we'd laughed about yesterday, had no dial tone. Even the Wi-Fi router, which had worked perfectly for Instagram posts the day before, was dark and unplugged, the cable severed clean through with what must have been wire cutters. I ran outside yelling Jenna's name until my throat went raw, but the hills just swallowed the sound, and I remembered we hadn't seen another house for miles on the drive in. The Fiat was still parked where we'd left it, but when I turned the key, nothing happened. Not even the clicking sound of a dead battery. Someone had removed the starter cable during the night while we slept in that too-perfect bedroom. Giorgio wasn't supposed to arrive until 8, but I kept checking my dead phone like it would magically tell me the time. The sun seemed frozen in place, and every sound from the woods made me jump, expecting either Jenna or whoever had taken her to emerge from the trees. I found a knife in the kitchen, one of those huge Italian bread knives, and sat on the front steps gripping it so hard my knuckles turned white. Birds kept singing like nothing was wrong, and the automatic sprinklers turned on at what must have been 7:30, spraying the garden in perfect arcs while my wife was somewhere being held by people who staged vacation rentals to trap tourists. When I heard the distinctive rattle of Giorgio's Alfa Romeo climbing the dirt road, I almost cried from relief. But as the car pulled up, I saw he wasn't alone. 2 other men sat in the back, both wearing the kind of clothes you'd expect on construction workers, and none of them looked surprised to see me standing there covered in blood from my shin, holding a knife, and absolutely losing my mind. The taller man said something to Giorgio in Italian that made him laugh, a sound that belonged in a bar among friends, not in this nightmare I was living. They approached slowly, hands visible and empty, like you'd approach a spooked horse, and Giorgio kept repeating, "Tranquillo, tranquillo," which I knew meant calm down. The second man, younger with a scar that split his left eyebrow in two, held up a cell phone showing a video of Jenna sitting in what looked like a warehouse. Duct tape over her mouth, but clearly alive, still wearing the sundress from yesterday. Giorgio finally spoke in his broken English, explaining that this was business, nothing personal, that my family would receive instructions for payment within 12 hours, and if everyone cooperated, we'd be back home telling this story like a bad dream. The scarred one pulled out a pair of those same zip ties I'd seen in the cellar, and I actually considered fighting, 3 against 1 with my pathetic bread knife. But then I thought about Jenna in that warehouse and let the knife fall onto the gravel. They zip-tied my wrists in front of me, loose enough that I didn't lose circulation, almost professional in their efficiency, then walked me to a white van I hadn't noticed parked behind the villa. Inside, the walls were lined with foam soundproofing, and there were water bottles in a cooler, granola bars in a box, even a portable toilet behind a curtain, like they'd done this enough times to work out the logistics of keeping hostages alive and functional. During the ride, Giorgio sat next to me scrolling through his phone, occasionally showing me photos of other couples who'd stayed at the villa, their smiling faces by the pool, at the dinner table, the same spots where Jenna and I had posed less than 24 hours ago. He explained in his limited vocabulary that most families paid within 3 days, that they had contacts at Western Union who made sure the transfers went through quickly, and that only one couple had ever tried to involve the police, which hadn't ended well for anyone. The younger guy drove while the tall one made phone calls in Italian, mentioning dollar amount that made my stomach turn, knowing my parents would have to sell their house to even get close to what these men expected. The warehouse was about 40 minutes away, tucked into an industrial area outside Arezzo, where the sound of machinery would mask pretty much anything. They kept us in separate rooms, but every few hours they'd let me see Jenna through a window, always from a distance, always brief, just enough to confirm she was still breathing. They gave us bottled water, sandwiches from a local shop, and even let us use a real bathroom with supervision, maintaining this weird professionalism like they were running a hotel instead of a kidnapping ring. On the second night, Giorgio brought me a cell phone to call my father, coaching me through exactly what to say, how to ask for the money without mentioning Italy or the police, just telling him we'd gotten into serious trouble and needed help immediately. I heard my dad's voice crack when he said he'd figure something out, and Giorgio nodded approvingly, patting my shoulder like I'd done a good job. They moved us twice over those 3 days, always at night, always in different vehicles, until I completely lost track of where we were. On the morning of the 4th day, they drove us to a rest stop near the A1 motorway, handed us our passports and a burner phone with one number programmed in it, and told us to call that number in exactly 1 hour to get our car keys back. Giorgio shook my hand before leaving, like we'd just concluded a business deal, and reminded me that they had our home address, our parents' addresses, and that their organization had people in the States too, so talking to anyone about this would be inadvisable. We found our rental car at another location 20 miles away, keys under the mat as promised, with just enough gas to reach the airport. Jenna didn't speak for the entire drive, just stared out the window at the Italian countryside that had seemed so romantic 4 days ago. We told the rental agency someone had stolen our car, and we'd found it abandoned. Told our families we'd gotten mixed up with some dangerous people but managed to pay them off, and never once mentioned the villa or the truth to anyone except you strangers on this forum, because honestly, who would believe us anyway? And more importantly, we still get emails sometimes from Italian addresses we don't recognize, just photos of tourist couples smiling by pools, a reminder that Giorgio and his friends are still out there, still watching. The turquoise water looked exactly like the photos when we arrived at Isla Solitaria, this exclusive eco-resort that my wife Natalie and I had saved 3 years to afford. We'd been together since college, and after all those years of cheap dates and ramen dinners, we thought we'd found paradise on this tiny private island, about 40 miles off the coast of Belize. The place only hosted 12 couples at a time, and the owner, this silver-haired British guy named Cromwell, personally greeted each guest at the dock with fresh coconut water and a rehearsed speech about sustainable tourism. Everything felt perfect that first afternoon. The thatched roof bungalows, the infinity pool overlooking the reef, the way the staff remembered your name after hearing it just once. We spent the evening chatting with other couples over rum cocktails, everyone sharing their wedding stories and travel plans, completely unaware that within 24 hours, we'd be fighting for our lives. That first night, the storm hit around midnight with a violence I'd never experienced before, even growing up in hurricane country. The wind sounded like freight trains colliding, and the rain hammered our bungalow's roof so hard that Natalie and I had to shout to hear each other from 3 feet away. The power flickered out around 2 in the morning, and we huddled together in the suffocating darkness, listening to palm trees snapping like matchsticks outside. When dawn finally came, the island looked like a war zone. Debris everywhere, the beach reshaped, several structures damaged beyond recognition. But what really made my chest tighten was the silence from the other bungalows. We could see 8 of them from our doorway, and not a single person was visible. No voices carrying across the humid morning air. No movement except for the resort staff who were already out with wheelbarrows and machetes, cleaning up like nothing unusual had happened. Natalie grabbed my arm when we walked toward the main lodge for breakfast, her fingernails digging into my skin as she pointed at the Johnsons' bungalow, the retired couple from Minnesota we'd played cards with the night before. Their door hung wide open, the white curtains flapping like surrender flags in the breeze, and their suitcases were still stacked neatly by the bed, visible from where we stood on the sandy path. The lodge itself felt wrong the moment we entered. Only 3 tables had settings, despite 12 couples supposedly being on the island, and the usually chatty waitstaff moved around us in complete silence, avoiding eye contact like we were contagious. Cromwell appeared from his office, his linen shirt impossibly crisp despite the humidity, and announced that the morning boat to the mainland had been postponed due to dangerous conditions in the channel, though the sky was cloudless and the ocean looked calmer than a lake. We tried talking to the only other couple at breakfast, honeymooners from Canada whose names I never caught, but they kept glancing at the kitchen door every few seconds, their eggs untouched on their plates. The wife leaned across her table and whispered that she'd heard screaming during the storm. Not wind, but actual human screaming, and that their neighbors in Bungalow 6 had vanished along with their belongings, like they'd never existed at all. Her husband quickly hushed her when a waiter approached, but I noticed how his knuckles went white gripping his coffee mug, and how he flinched when Cromwell walked past our table with that practiced smile of his. Natalie and I decided to head back to our bungalow to pack. Something about the atmosphere made us both want to leave immediately, storm damage or not. But when we got there, our door was locked from the inside, and we could hear someone moving around in our room, opening drawers and shuffling through our things. The maintenance guy who opened our door for us, this weathered local named Baptiste with a scar running from his left ear to his collarbone, kept apologizing in broken English about confusion with cleaning schedule, while his eyes darted everywhere except our faces. Inside, our passports had been moved from the safe to the nightstand, spread open to the photo pages, and Natalie's jewelry box was sitting on the bathroom counter when she'd specifically left it buried in her suitcase. Baptiste hurried away before we could ask more questions, practically jogging down the beach path, and that's when I noticed all the staff members were wearing these identical silver medical bracelets I hadn't seen the day before, each one engraved with numbers instead of names. We started packing frantically, throwing clothes into bags without folding them, and I tried calling the mainland ferry service using the room phone, but the line just rang and rang, until eventually a recorded message in Spanish said the number was no longer in service. Natalie was zipping up her suitcase when we heard the Canadian woman screaming from somewhere near the pool area. Not a startled scream, but the kind that comes from pure terror, raw and desperate. We ran outside to find her standing alone by the pool bar, hyperventilating and pointing at the storage shed behind the kitchen, where her husband had gone to look for their missing snorkeling gear 10 minutes earlier. The shed door was padlocked now, and through the gap underneath, a dark puddle was spreading across the white sand, too thick to be water, too red to be anything but blood. Cromwell materialized beside us with 2 large staff members, island guys built like NFL linebackers, and calmly explained that her husband had, unfortunately, injured himself on some storm debris and was being treated in the medical facility on the other side of the island, though nobody remembered seeing any medical facility during yesterday's welcome tour. The Canadian woman kept screaming that she wanted to see her husband, begging Cromwell to take her to this supposed medical facility, but he just smiled that empty smile and had his men escort her away, supposedly to reunite her with her spouse. Natalie and I exchanged a look that said everything. We needed to get off this island immediately, boats or no boats. We rushed back to grab our bags and head for the dock, but the path was blocked by Baptiste and 3 other workers carrying metal coolers, the expensive medical kind with biohazard symbols, loading them onto a golf cart with practiced efficiency. When Baptiste saw us, he dropped his cooler, and it popped open for just a second, long enough for me to glimpse clear bags filled with ice and something dark red and organic looking, before he slammed it shut and started shouting at us in Creole to go back to our room, that it wasn't safe to wander around. We turned and ran the opposite direction, toward the dense jungle interior, where we'd seen a maintenance trail during yesterday's nature walk, figuring we could circle around to the dock from the other side. The path was barely visible under the storm debris, and we had to climb over fallen trees and wade through pools of muddy water that came up to our knees, all while hearing voices behind us getting closer, Cromwell's British accent mixing with rapid-fire Creole. About half a mile in, we stumbled into a clearing that shouldn't have existed, filled with medical equipment that looked like it belonged in a surgical suite. IV stands, monitors, those bright overhead lights surgeons use, all protected under military-style camouflage netting. There were gurneys arranged in rows, some still with dark stains on the white sheets, and a generator humming in the corner next to refrigeration units identical to the coolers we'd seen, their temperature displays glowing red in the jungle shade. Before we could process what we were seeing, Natalie grabbed a clipboard hanging from one of the gurneys, and her face went completely pale as she read it out loud. It was a medical chart with the Johnson woman's name at the top, listing her blood type, tissue compatibility markers, and a detailed diagram of kidneys with harvest times noted in neat handwriting. The chart underneath had the Canadian man's information, check marks next to liver and corneas, with processing complete stamped across the bottom in red ink. That's when we heard the boat engine starting up at the dock. Not the resort's usual shuttle, but something bigger, more powerful, and Cromwell's voice carrying through the trees, telling someone on a radio that they had 2 more matches for the Mumbai buyer and to prep the facility immediately. We dropped everything and ran harder than I've ever run in my life, crashing through vines and branches, not caring about the cuts and scrapes, just needing to reach that dock before the boat left us stranded with these monsters. The jungle opened up suddenly and we burst onto the beach about 200 yards from the dock, where a sleek speedboat was being loaded with those same medical coolers by men in surgical scrubs. Natalie spotted a small motorboat tied up on the far side of the dock, partially hidden behind the dive shop, probably used by staff for supply runs to nearby islands. We stayed low, using the storm-scattered palm fronds and debris as cover, creeping along the tree line while the loading crew focused on their grim cargo. Just as we reached the dive shop, Baptiste emerged from behind a stack of oxygen tanks, holding a syringe filled with something clear, his scarred face expressionless as he moved toward us with the practiced calm of someone who'd done this before. Natalie swung her beach bag at Baptiste's head with everything she had, connecting with a sick thud that sent him stumbling backward into the tanks, the syringe flying from his hand into the sand. We didn't wait to see if he got up. We sprinted for the small boat, fumbling with the mooring ropes while shouts erupted from the main dock, Cromwell's British accent cutting through the chaos, ordering his men to stop us at any cost. The engine took 3 pulls to start, coughing black smoke before finally roaring to life, and we shot away from the dock just as 2 men reached the spot where we'd been standing, one of them diving into the water after us but quickly giving up as we gained distance. Behind us, the island grew smaller, that paradise facade hiding its nightmare reality, and Natalie steered us toward a fishing boat we could see on the horizon while I kept watch for any pursuit, my heart hammering so hard I thought it might explode. The fisherman who picked us up spoke limited English but understood enough when we kept repeating police and emergency, and they radioed the Belize Coast Guard while racing us toward the mainland at full speed. It took 3 days of giving statements, identifying photos of missing tourists from across the Caribbean, and working with international investigators before they raided Isla Solitaria, finding the surgical facility still intact but the staff long gone. Cromwell vanished like smoke. They recovered evidence of at least 40 victims over 2 years, mostly young healthy couples who'd won discount packages to the resort or booked through specific travel sites that turned out to be fronts. We testified via video link at several trials, helped shut down 3 connected operations in Central America, and still wake up sometimes thinking we're back in that bungalow, hearing footsteps on the sand outside. The investigator told us we were lucky. Most couples who checked into places like Isla Solitaria never checked out at all, just became names on missing persons reports that nobody ever solved. Their organs sold to the highest bidder, while their families wondered why they stopped answering emails from paradise. The nightmares haven't stopped since Vermont. Every single night brings me right back to that cabin, to those woods, to the moment everything went wrong. Sleep doesn't come easy anymore. When it does, I wake up screaming his name, drenched in sweat, reaching for someone who isn't there. It's been 8 weeks now, and the therapist says writing it all down might help, that sharing what happened could be part of the healing process. Part of me doubts anything will ever heal this wound, but here goes nothing. At 28, I thought I had life figured out. Decent job at a marketing firm in Boston. Finally married to my college sweetheart Nathan after 6 years of dating, and ready to start the next chapter of our lives together. We'd saved for 2 years for the perfect honeymoon, but with everything going on in the world, we decided to skip the tropical beaches and find something more intimate, more us. Nathan found the listing on this obscure rental site, and the moment we saw those photos of the cabin nestled between pine trees with mountain views, we knew it was exactly what we wanted. The drive up there in early October should have been romantic. Leaves changing colors, winding roads through small towns where everyone waves at strangers. The kind of New England postcard scenes you see in movies. Nathan kept making jokes about horror movie setups, asking if I'd packed my running shoes just in case we needed to escape some backwoods killer. I remember laughing, playfully punching his arm while he drove our rented SUV deeper into the wilderness. The GPS lost signal about 40 minutes before we reached the property, but the owner, Harold Brennan, had sent detailed directions that Nathan had printed out old-school style. Each turn took us further from civilization. First the paved roads became gravel, then dirt, until finally we were bouncing along what could barely be called a path. When we finally saw the cabin through the trees, it took my breath away. Not because it was beautiful, though it had its rustic charm, but because of how completely alone it felt. The nearest neighbor was supposedly 8 miles away, and cell service was non-existent. Harold had mentioned this in his emails, even suggesting we could pay extra for a satellite phone if we wanted. We'd declined, thinking it would be romantic to be completely disconnected for a week. Harold met us at the cabin around 4 that afternoon, pulling up in a mud-splattered pickup truck that had seen better decades. He was nothing like I'd imagined from our email exchanges, maybe early 60s, thin as a scarecrow, with these pale gray eyes that never seemed to blink enough. His handshake felt like grabbing a dead fish, cold and slightly damp, and he had this habit of licking his lips between sentences that made my skin prickle. He walked us through the cabin, showing us how to work the wood stove, where the firewood was stacked, how to prime the water pump if it got temperamental. The whole time he kept mentioning little things about previous guests, how the Andersons loved the sunrise from the bedroom window, how the Patel family had spotted a moose near the creek, how some photographer from New York had taken award-winning shots from the back deck. At the time, I thought he was just being a chatty host, trying to make us feel welcome. Nathan even joked later that Harold probably didn't get much company living out here. Before leaving, Harold handed us a laminated sheet with emergency numbers and pointed to a red mark on a hand-drawn map showing where we might get 1 bar of cell signal if absolutely necessary. About a 15-minute hike up the nearest hill. The first 2 days were everything we'd hoped for. We cooked breakfast together on the ancient gas stove, went for long walks following deer trails through the woods, made love in the afternoon when golden light streamed through the bedroom windows. Nathan had brought his guitar, and we'd sit on the porch in the evenings while he played old songs badly, and I laughed at his made-up lyrics. The isolation felt like a blessing. No work emails, no social media, no news about the outside world. Just us, the mountains, and the occasional wildlife visitor. On the second night, we saw a family of raccoons investigating the garbage bins, and Nathan spent 20 minutes trying to get the perfect photo with his camera. The cabin itself was cozy in that rustic way city people romanticize. Handmade quilts on the beds, cast iron pans hanging in the kitchen, shelves lined with yellowed paperbacks and board games from the 70s. There was something odd about the decor, though. Mixed in with the typical cabin stuff were these random mirrors, not decorative ones, but plain, functional mirrors placed in weird spots. One faced the bed at an angle, another was mounted high in the corner of the living room, and there was even a small one in the shower that served no obvious purpose. I mentioned it to Nathan, but he just shrugged and said, "Old houses always have weird quirks from different owners over the years." Everything changed on our third night. We'd spent the day hiking to a waterfall Harold had marked on his map, and we were exhausted in that good way that makes you sleep like the dead. Around 2 in the morning, Nathan suddenly sat up in bed, fully alert. I remember the moonlight catching his profile as he tilted his head, listening to something I couldn't hear yet. Then it came. A rhythmic creaking sound from somewhere outside, like metal swaying in the wind. Except there was no wind that night. The trees outside our window stood perfectly still in the moonlight. Nathan whispered that it sounded like it was coming from behind the cabin, near where the old tool shed stood. We lay there for maybe 10 minutes, just listening as the sound continued, steady and deliberate. Finally, Nathan's protective instincts kicked in. He pulled on his jeans and boots, grabbed the flashlight from the nightstand, and told me to lock the door behind him. I begged him not to go, even offered to come with him, but he insisted it was probably just a loose gutter or maybe an animal caught in something. He kissed my forehead and said he'd be right back. Just wanted to make sure everything was secure so we could sleep peacefully. Those were the last words he ever said to me. I watched from the bedroom window as his flashlight beam cut through the darkness, moving along the side of the cabin toward the back. The creaking stopped the moment he rounded the corner out of my sight. I waited, counting my breaths, telling myself he'd reappear any second with some silly explanation. 5 minutes passed, then 10. At the 15-minute mark, I called out his name from the window, quietly at first, then louder. Nothing. Not even an echo back. The forest had gone completely silent. No insects, no rustling leaves, no night birds. That kind of silence that makes your ears ring and your heart pound because nature is never that quiet unless something is very wrong. I threw on my coat over my pajamas, grabbed the only other flashlight we had, a weak penlight from my purse, and stepped out onto the porch. The wooden boards groaned under my feet, the sound explosively loud in the unnatural quiet. I made my way to the corner of the cabin where I'd last seen Nathan's light, my pathetic beam barely penetrating the darkness. Behind the cabin, the tool shed door stood wide open, swinging slightly despite the still air. Nathan's flashlight lay on the ground about 10 feet from the shed, still on, its beam pointing toward the tree line. Next to it, dark stains in the dirt that looked black in the darkness but would later be confirmed by police as blood. Panic took over every cell in my body. I ran back to the cabin, slamming the door behind me, my mind racing through options that all seemed impossible. No cell phone service, no car keys. Nathan had them in his pocket. And the nearest help was 8 miles through woods I didn't know in pitch darkness. I remembered Harold's map with the cell signal spot and grabbed it with shaking fingers, but the thought of hiking 15 minutes uphill alone, leaving the relative safety of the cabin, knowing something had happened to Nathan out there, paralyzed me. I did the only thing I could think of. I barricaded myself in the bedroom, pushing the heavy dresser against the door, and sat on the bed clutching a kitchen knife, waiting for dawn. Every sound made me jump. The settling of wood, the hum of the old refrigerator, a branch scraping the roof. I called Nathan's name every few minutes, hoping against hope he'd answer, that he'd stumble back injured but alive. The hours until sunrise felt like days. When the first gray light finally filtered through the trees, I forced myself to venture out again. The blood trail led from where the flashlight lay toward the woods, disappearing into the undergrowth about 20 yards in. There were drag marks in the dirt, 2 parallel grooves like something heavy had been pulled. Nathan's wedding ring, the one we'd picked out together just 3 months ago, lay in the dirt near the tree line, and seeing it there broke something inside me. The hike to get cell signal was the longest 15 minutes of my life. Every shadow could be whoever took Nathan. Every sound might be footsteps following me. When I finally got 1 bar of signal, my fingers could barely work the phone to dial 911. The state police arrived within an hour, followed by search and rescue teams with dogs. They treated me like I might be a suspect at first, asking the same questions over and over until I could barely speak through my sobs. The dogs picked up Nathan's scent immediately, following it deep into the woods before losing it at a creek about half a mile from the cabin. That's when one of the younger officers, sweeping the area with fresh eyes, noticed something odd about a tree near the tool shed. There was a small device attached to the trunk about 12 feet up, painted to match the bark. A camera. Once they found the first one, they found dozens more, in trees under the eaves of the cabin, hidden in birdhouses everywhere. The technical team they brought in said it was a sophisticated setup, all wirelessly connected, all with night vision capability. Inside the cabin, what I'd thought were oddly placed mirrors turned out to be two-way glass with more cameras behind them. The bedroom, the bathroom, the living room. Every inch of that cabin had been under surveillance. The investigation moved fast after that. Within hours, they'd traced the camera feeds to a server farm in Harold's basement, not his main house, but a property he owned about 3 miles away. The FBI got involved when they discovered the scope of what he'd been doing. For 11 years, Harold had been running a subscription website on the dark web, where people could pay to watch unsuspecting guests at his 3 rental properties in real time. The Vermont cabin was his most popular stream, apparently, because of its isolation. Subscribers could even pay extra to make requests, to vote on which couples to target for special experiences. They found chat logs where viewers discussed intimate moments they'd watched, rating guests like they were performers, sharing screenshots, making predictions about relationships. One regular viewer, username BearHunter47, had paid Harold $20,000 for what he called an interaction package the week we were there. The police showed me his messages, and I had to run to the bathroom to throw up. He'd been watching us since we arrived, commenting on everything from what I wore to bed, to how Nathan liked his coffee. He'd specifically requested that Harold create a situation to separate us on our 3rd night. Harold broke down during interrogation and gave them everything. He admitted to using speakers hidden in the woods to create sounds that would lure curious guests outside at night. Usually nothing more happened. He just wanted dramatic footage for his viewers, people getting scared, maybe some arguments between couples. But BearHunter47 was different. Harold claimed he didn't know exactly what the man had planned, just that he'd arrived that afternoon before the creaking sounds started, that he was supposed to wait in the tool shed, and that Harold would get another payment once he completed whatever he intended to do. The man's real name was Christopher Voss, a 43-year-old logistics manager from New Hampshire, with no prior record, just a normal-looking guy with a wife and 2 kids who spent his evenings watching strangers through hidden cameras. The police found Nathan's blood in his van, along with rope, surgical tools, and a collection of items taken from previous guests Harold couldn't explain. Pieces of jewelry, driver's licenses, even a journal from a woman who'd stayed at the cabin in 2017. They tracked Voss to a hunting property his family owned in the White Mountains. By the time they got there, he'd already burned most of the evidence, but they found enough DNA evidence to connect him to Nathan and at least 2 other missing persons cases from New England. They never found Nathan's body. Voss refused to talk even with a plea deal on the table, just sat there with this blank expression during every interrogation. The prosecutors said they had enough physical evidence to convict him without a confession. Nathan's blood in his vehicle, his DNA at the cabin, the digital trail of payments and messages. He got life without parole. But that doesn't bring Nathan back. Harold got 25 years for his part in it all, and they're still tracking down the hundreds of subscribers who'd been watching his streams over the years. Some were just lonely perverts, but others, like Voss, were something much worse. The FBI agent assigned to my case told me they'd prevented at least 3 other planned interactions after seizing Harold's servers. 3 other couples who have no idea how close they came to living through what I did, or worse. The other 2 properties Harold operated were in Maine and New Hampshire, both marketed to couples looking for romantic getaways. The agent said some subscribers had been watching the same couples year after year, since many returned for anniversary trips. One couple had been watched on 4 different occasions without ever knowing it. Their most intimate moments broadcast to strangers who discussed them like characters in a TV show. What haunts me most isn't just that Nathan is gone. It's knowing that our last days together, what should have been private moments between newlyweds, were entertainment for strangers. They watched us make breakfast, saw us kiss goodmorning, observed our little arguments about which trail to hike, witnessed our lovemaking. Every sweet nothing Nathan whispered to me, every inside joke we shared, every vulnerable moment. All of it was consumed by people sitting in dark rooms, getting off on our privacy being violated. I found out later that clips from our stay were already being shared on certain forums before Nathan disappeared, tagged with our first names and descriptions of us, like we were adult performers. Sometimes I wake up at night, convinced I can feel eyes on me even in my new apartment with its checked and rechecked locks, its absence of mirrors, its every corner examined for cameras. I've moved twice since October, changed jobs, legally changed my last name back to my maiden name to make myself harder to find online. But I know those videos are still out there somewhere, that strangers still have pieces of our life together, our last week together. The FBI says they're doing everything they can to scrub them from the internet, but we all know that's impossible. Once something is online, it's there forever, being traded in dark corners by people who see tragedy as entertainment. Nathan's mother calls sometimes, and we cry together, bonded by this specific kind of loss that no one else can really understand. Losing someone not just to murder, but to a spectacle, a show we never auditioned for. Northern Michigan gets empty after Labor Day, which is exactly why Melissa and I decided to book a lakefront cottage for our 5th anniversary in early September. My wife had been working double shifts doing medical transcription all summer, and between that and my online teaching gig, we desperately needed to disconnect from everything. A colleague mentioned this booking site where owners dump their properties for cheap when they get last-minute cancellations, and that's how we found the place. A 2-bedroom cottage with its own dock, surrounded by pine forest, going for less than what we'd normally pay for a motel room. 5 years of marriage and approaching 30 had taught us both to recognize a good deal when we saw one, even if the photos looked a bit dated and the reviews were strangely sparse. We packed our Honda Accord with enough groceries for a week, threw in our swimming gear and some books we'd been meaning to read, and drove 6 hours north from Chicago through increasingly desolate stretches of highway. The GPS lost signal twice in the final hour, leaving us to navigate by a hand-drawn map the owner had emailed, complete with landmarks like Big Dead Oak and rusted blue mailbox. When we finally pulled into the gravel driveway that Thursday afternoon, the isolation hit us immediately. Nothing but trees, water, and silence. The cottage had that distinct character of a place frozen somewhere around 1987. Wood paneling on every wall, a stone fireplace that looked like it hadn't been cleaned since Reagan was president, and kitchen appliances in various shades of harvest gold and avocado green. While Melissa tested the squeaky bed and unpacked our clothes into a dresser that smelled like mothballs and cedar, I wandered the property to get our bearings. The dock stretched about 20 feet into the lake, solid despite its weathered appearance, with an aluminum rowboat tied to the end, and a ladder descending into water so dark it looked like oil. Behind the cottage stood a padlocked shed, with a handwritten "Keep Out" sign that the owner had emphasized 3 times in his emails, though curiosity made me peer through a gap in the boards to see nothing but shadows and what looked like old furniture covered in tarps. The opposite shore of the lake lay maybe 300 yards away, just a thick wall of trees with no visible structures, no docks, no signs of life at all. That first evening passed like something from a movie about happy couples. We grilled burgers on the rusty charcoal barbecue, shared a bottle of wine while dangling our feet off the dock, and watched the sun sink behind the pines. Later, around 10:30, when I stepped outside to bring in our forgotten wine glasses, a pinprick of light caught my attention across the water, moving slowly between the trees on the far shore. Too steady and purposeful to be a firefly, too deliberate to be someone just out for a casual walk. Friday started with the kind of peaceful morning you only get at places like this. Loons calling across the water, mist rising off the lake like something supernatural, and Melissa making pancakes while wearing my old college sweatshirt. We spent the day doing absolutely nothing productive, alternating between reading on the dock, taking the rowboat out to the middle of the lake, and napping in the hammock strung between two massive pines. The water was colder than expected for September, but clean enough that you could see your feet, even when you were chest deep, and we found a family of painted turtles sunning themselves on a half-submerged log near the shore. Around dinner time, while I was starting the grill for our fish dinner, Melissa called me over to the living room window with a strange expression on her face. She pointed across the lake where someone was standing at the tree line, barely visible in the fading light, just a dark figure against the darker forest. We watched for maybe 5 minutes, debating whether to wave or ignore them, when the person raised what looked like binoculars to their face, pointed directly at our cottage. The moment I raised my hand in an awkward greeting, they stepped backward into the trees and vanished, leaving us both with that uncomfortable feeling you get when you realize you've been watched without knowing for how long. That night, we tried to laugh it off over dinner, making jokes about creepy locals and city folks who didn't understand rural curiosity, but neither of us felt quite as relaxed as we had the night before. Melissa suggested we close all the curtains, something we hadn't bothered with the first night since there was supposedly no one around to see inside anyway, and I found myself double-checking that all the doors were locked before we went to bed. Around 2 in the morning, I woke up needing the bathroom and noticed a soft glow coming through a gap in the bedroom curtains. At first, I thought it might be moonlight reflecting off the water, but when I carefully peeled back the fabric to peek outside, there was that flashlight again, scanning slowly back and forth across our cottage from the opposite shore. This time, though, the light would pause whenever it hit a window, lingering for several seconds as if the person holding it was trying to see inside, studying our place room by room. I watched, fascinated and disturbed in equal measure, as the beam methodically examined our rental, stopping longest at the bedroom window where I was standing, and I could swear that even across all that dark water, whoever was holding that light knew I was watching them watch us. Saturday morning brought an argument, the first real one we'd had in months, with Melissa insisting we should pack up and leave while I kept saying we were overreacting to what was probably just some local weirdo with boundary issues. She reminded me about the drastically reduced price, the sparse reviews, the way the owner had been so eager to confirm our booking within minutes of my inquiry, details that suddenly seemed less like good fortune and more like warning signs we'd chosen to ignore. But pride and stubbornness won out. I'd spent good money on this trip, planned it for months, and I wasn't going to let some creep with a flashlight ruin our anniversary. We compromised by agreeing to spend the day away from the cottage, driving 40 minutes to the nearest town where we ate lunch at a diner full of mounted deer heads and locals who stared at us like we'd grown extra limbs. The teenage waitress, after hearing we were staying at the old Carlson place by the lake, gave us this look that was equal parts pity and surprise, then quickly busied herself refilling our already full coffee cups. On the drive back, Melissa stayed quiet, scrolling through her phone trying to find any information about our rental, any reviews that might explain what we were dealing with. But the listing had somehow vanished from the booking site entirely. We got back to the cottage around 5, And the first thing I noticed was that the padlock on the shed was hanging open, the door slightly ajar despite the owner's explicit instructions to stay out. My first thought was that maybe he'd come by to check on something while we were gone, but there was no note, no missed calls, nothing to indicate anyone had been there legitimately. Against Melissa's protests, I walked over and pushed the door open wider, using my phone's flashlight to pierce the musty darkness inside. The shed was packed with the expected junk: moldy life jackets, broken fishing rods, stacks of waterlogged newspapers from the 90s. But along the back wall stood something that made no sense at all. A neat row of at least a dozen flashlights of varying sizes, all clean and modern looking, arranged on a shelf like some kind of collection. Below them, thumbtacked to the wall, were what looked like printed screenshots from rental listing sites, showing different photos of our cottage across different seasons, each with different titles and descriptions, like someone had been creating and deleting listings over and over again. The real gut punch came when I noticed the dates on some of the printouts. Bookings going back 2 years, all for roughly week-long stays, all with different names highlighted in yellow marker. Melissa was already throwing clothes into our bags when I got back to the cottage, her face pale and her jaw set in that way that meant discussion was pointless. I started to tell her about the shed, but she cut me off, holding up her phone to show me something she'd found buried in a local Facebook group. A post from the previous summer, where someone asked if anyone else had experienced weird stuff at a lake rental in our area. The comments were mostly deleted, but one remained from a woman saying she and her husband had cut their stay short after someone kept watching them from across the lake, and that when they'd complained to the owner, he'd seemed confused and claimed he didn't know what property they were talking about. That's when the pieces started clicking together in the worst possible way. The too good price, the eager booking confirmation, the owner who only communicated through email and had insisted on payment through a wire transfer. We'd been so focused on the person watching us that we'd never considered the possibility that the actual owner of this cottage might have no idea we were even here. The sound of footsteps on the deck made us both freeze, heavy and deliberate. Definitely not an animal. And when I peered through the kitchen window, I saw a man standing at our door, not knocking, just standing there with one hand pressed against the wood like he was feeling for vibrations. He was maybe 60, wearing clothes that looked like they'd been washed in lake water and dried in the sun too many times. Everything slightly gray and stiff-looking, hanging on a thin frame that seemed built for crawling through small spaces. His hair grew in uneven patches, like he'd been cutting it himself without a mirror, and his fingernails were so long they clicked against the door as he ran his hands across it. When he finally knocked, 3 slow, measured raps, Melissa grabbed my arm so tight it hurt, shaking her head violently, but something in me needed to know what we were dealing with. I opened the door just a crack, keeping the chain on, and the smell hit me immediately. Mildew and earth and something chemical like old batteries. His eyes were the worst part, not threatening or angry, but eager in a way that made my stomach turn, like a kid about to show you his favorite toy. He asked if we were enjoying our stay in a voice that sounded unused, raspy, and too high for his size. And when I demanded to know who he was, he just smiled and said he was the one who'd been making sure we were safe at night, keeping watch from across the lake, making sure nobody bothered us. The flashlight hanging from his belt was one of those expensive tactical models, the lens still dirty with fingerprints from being held against windows. Before I could respond, he pushed something through the crack in the door, a stack of Polaroid photos that scattered across the floor when I instinctively stepped back. They were all of us, Melissa and me, taken from across the lake with what must have been a telephoto lens or high-powered scope, showing us through the windows at different times over the past 2 days. Eating breakfast, reading on the couch, getting ready for bed, private moments we thought were just ours, all captured with disturbing clarity. But mixed in with our photos were others, older ones with different couples in the same cottage, doing the same ordinary things, unaware they were being documented like specimens in some sick collection. The man kept talking while I stared at the photos, explaining in his broken voice how he'd been living across the lake for 15 years, how the cottage had been empty for so long until he figured out how to list it online, how he picked nice couples who looked like they needed a quiet getaway. The money from the rentals, he said, went into a separate account he'd set up to pay the property taxes and keep the electricity on, keep his watching post functional. He seemed genuinely confused when I started yelling at him to leave, tilting his head like a dog hearing a strange sound, asking if we didn't like how he'd maintained the place, if the sheets weren't clean enough, if we needed more towels. The situation spiraled fast after that. I slammed the door in his face while Melissa called 911, but our cell service kept cutting in and out, the calls dropping after a few seconds of static. Through the window we could see him still standing on the deck, not trying to break in, just standing there swaying slightly like he was listening to music only he could hear. After 10 minutes of failed phone calls, we decided to risk it, grabbing our bags and car keys, leaving everything else behind. The moment we opened the door, he stepped aside politely, even offered to help with our bags, still seeming oblivious to why we were terrified of him. We ran to the car, and as I fumbled with the keys, he called out that he had something to show us, something that would explain everything, something special he'd built just for his guests. The engine turned over on the third try, and as we peeled out of the driveway, gravel flying everywhere. I saw him in the rearview mirror pulling up a metal hatch hidden in the ground near the shed, disappearing into whatever was beneath it like he was going home. We drove for 20 minutes before finding enough signal to call the police, our hands shaking so bad we could barely hold our phones. The sheriff's department took our report at a gas station parking lot, 2 deputies writing everything down while shooting each other looks that suggested this wasn't their first call about that cottage. They followed us back, bringing backup, and what they found turned into something that made the local news for weeks afterward. The man, whose name turned out to be Vernon Keller, was already gone, but the tunnel system they discovered beneath the property was extensive, a network of passages he'd dug over more than a decade, connecting the cottage to 3 different observation points around the lake, including a furnished underground room directly beneath the master bedroom. The walls of his main chamber were covered with those screenshots I'd seen in the shed, but also hundreds more photos of couples dating back years, all carefully organized in photo albums labeled with dates and names he'd apparently harvested from their fake booking confirmations. The police found his actual residence built into a hillside across the lake, camouflaged so well it was invisible from the water, where he'd been living off the rental income while perfecting his underground network. They said he'd been a mining engineer before some kind of breakdown in his 50s, which explained how he'd managed to construct such an elaborate system without it collapsing, complete with ventilation shafts hidden in tree stumps and waterproof lighting powered by cables he'd spliced from the cottage's electrical system. Vernon turned himself in 3 days later at a hospital in Wisconsin, dehydrated and rambling about how he just wanted to take care of people, to watch over them, to make sure couples were happy during their special time away. The detective who called us with the update said Vernon genuinely couldn't understand why what he'd done was wrong, kept insisting he'd never hurt anyone, never even entered the cottage while it was occupied, just watched to make sure everyone was safe and enjoying themselves. The real owners of the cottage, an elderly couple from Indiana who hadn't visited in 5 years, were horrified to learn their property had been turned into Vernon's personal human terrarium. They found our contact information along with 17 other couples who'd been scammed the same way, all of us thinking we'd gotten a great deal on a romantic getaway. The tunnel system has been filled in now, the cottage demolished, but sometimes I still dream about that moment, when I looked through our bedroom curtain and saw that flashlight searching our windows, knowing now that he wasn't across the lake at all, but possibly right beneath us, watching through some gap we never knew existed. Melissa and I are still together, stronger maybe because of what we went through, but we don't take remote vacations anymore, and she still checks under beds in perfectly normal hotel rooms, looking for holes that probably aren't there. June in Texas hits different when you're driving through the desert with someone you just married. Brian and I had been husband and wife for exactly 4 days, still giddy from our Dallas wedding, still figuring out how those words sounded when we said them out loud. The honeymoon plan was nothing fancy, just the two of us, a rental car and 3 weeks to drive wherever the roads took us through the Southwest. We'd head through Texas, cross into New Mexico, maybe reach Arizona before flying home from Phoenix. Both 27 that year, we'd been planning this trip forever. Brian managed construction sites in Houston, and I taught 5th grade at an elementary school near downtown. Every paycheck for 2 years, we'd put something aside, determined to start our marriage with an adventure. That first night after leaving Dallas, we'd crashed at some forgettable chain hotel outside Fort Worth. The second night, though, we decided to take the scenic route, driving south along roads that ran parallel to the border. The gas gauge read just above a quarter tank when we realized how badly we'd misjudged the distances between towns. Nothing but desert stretched ahead according to our phones, maybe 100 miles before the next actual city. Brian kept mentioning that Exxon station we'd passed an hour back, how we should have stopped, but I'd been eager to cover more ground before dark. Then we spotted this hand-painted wooden sign, weathered and leaning slightly. Desert rose in 2 miles, with an arrow pointing down a dirt road that branched off the main highway. The GPS showed nothing there, just empty space, but we could make out lights in the distance, golden and warm against the purple desert twilight. Brian gave me this look, half worried, half curious, and turned the wheel without either of us discussing it. The dirt road was brutal, full of holes that made our sedan bottom out twice, dust coating everything. But eventually we pulled up to this old adobe-style building with a flickering neon vacancy sign. The place looked straight out of those old Western movies my dad used to watch, complete with wooden porch beams and actual swinging doors that led into what appeared to be the main office. A woman emerged before we'd even turned off the engine, like she'd been watching for us. Maybe 50, with graying hair pulled back in this impossibly tight bun, and wearing a floral apron over jeans and a checkered shirt. She had this way of smiling that made all her teeth show at once, waving at us with both hands like we were long-lost relatives finally come home. Behind her stood a younger man, probably early 30s, with arms thick as tree trunks and a beard that reached his chest. He didn't wave, just nodded once when our eyes met through the windshield. The woman practically bounced over to Brian's window, tapping on it with her knuckles before he'd even unbuckled his seatbelt. "Welcome, welcome, you two look exhausted. Come in, we've got the best room ready, always do for honeymooners." She said this before we'd mentioned anything about being newly married, but I figured maybe the just married soap writing on our back window gave it away, even though we'd tried to wash most of it off back in Dallas. The lobby, if you could call it that, was cramped but weirdly homey. Lots of old photographs covered every wall, all in mismatched frames. Pictures of families, cowboys, women in long dresses standing in front of the very building we'd just entered. A ceiling fan wobbled overhead, making this rhythmic clicking sound with each rotation. The younger man had followed us in, introduced himself as Thomas, said his mother Rosa owned the place, been in their family for 4 generations. Rosa bustled around behind a wooden counter that looked handmade, pulling out this ancient guest book, the kind with actual pages instead of a computer system. While Brian signed us in, she kept talking, mentioning how they rarely got guests anymore since the new highway was built 10 years ago. How lucky we were. They had a room available. How her daughter would be thrilled to have someone to cook for tonight. That should have been my first real warning. The place had a vacancy sign, but she acted like we were some massive stroke of luck for them. Tomas carried our suitcases without asking, just grabbed them from Brian and headed down a narrow hallway that smelled like old cedar and something else. Something chemical I couldn't place. Our room was at the very end of the hallway, past 3 other doors that were all closed tight. Tomas unlocked it with an actual skeleton key, the kind you see in antique shops, and pushed the door open with his shoulder like it was stuck. The room itself was bigger than I expected, with a king-sized bed covered in this bright orange bedspread with geometric patterns that hurt to look at for too long. Everything seemed clean enough, but old. The furniture all dark wood with scratches and water rings. A box television from the 80s sitting on a dresser. Thick curtains that blocked out any view of outside. Rosa appeared in the doorway while we were still looking around, announcing that dinner would be served in 20 minutes in the main house. That we simply had to try her daughter Carmen's enchiladas, the best in 3 counties. Brian tried to say we were tired. Maybe we'd just turn in early, but Rosa's face did this thing where her smile stayed exactly the same, but her eyes went hard. Nonsense. You need to eat. Growing boys need their strength. She patted Brian's arm with more force than seemed necessary, then swept out of the room before we could argue more. We whispered about leaving right then, just getting back in the car and driving until we found somewhere else, anywhere else. But the tank was low. We didn't know how far the next gas station was, and honestly, we felt stupid for being paranoid about what was probably just an overly friendly family running a struggling business. The dining room was attached to the main building through a covered walkway that creaked with every step. Only one table was set, with actual cloth napkins and everything. Candles already lit even though it wasn't fully dark yet. Carmen looked nothing like Rosa or Tomas. Blonde where they were dark, skinny where they were broad, maybe 19 or 20 with nervous eyes that kept flicking toward the kitchen door. She served us plates piled high with food, enchiladas drowning in green sauce, rice, beans, some kind of meat I couldn't identify. Rosa sat at the head of the table, watching us eat, asking about our families, our jobs, our plans for children. Tomas stood by the door, not eating, just standing there with his arms crossed. The food tasted fine, good even, but there was so much of it, and Rosa kept insisting we finish everything, kept refilling our water glasses before they were even half empty. By the time we got back to our room, I could barely keep my eyes open. Brian was swaying on his feet, mumbling something about how he'd only had 1 beer with dinner, but felt like he drank a whole 6-pack. We collapsed on that ugly orange bedspread without even changing clothes, just kicked off our shoes and passed out. The last thing I remember was hearing voices outside our window, speaking Spanish mixed with English, and the sound of a truck engine starting up. Then nothing, just this deep, heavy blackness that pulled me under completely. When I started coming back to consciousness, everything was wrong. The bed felt different, smaller, and the orange bedspread was gone, replaced by some rough gray blanket that smelled like mothballs and sweat. My mouth tasted like copper, and my head pounded so hard I could hear my own pulse in my ears. The room was different too. Concrete walls instead of wood paneling. No windows at all, just a single bare bulb hanging from the ceiling. Brian wasn't there. I called his name, tried to sit up, but my arms and legs felt like they weighed 1,000 pounds each. The door, not the wooden one from our room, but a metal one with a slot at the bottom, was locked from the outside. I pounded on it until my fists went numb, screamed until my throat went raw, but nobody came. Hours passed, maybe days, hard to tell without windows. Sometimes I'd hear footsteps outside, voices speaking in Spanish, occasional laughter that sounded nothing like Rosa's friendly chuckle from that dinner. They'd slide water bottles and packages of crackers under the door slot, never opening it fully, never responding when I begged them to tell me where Brian was, what they'd done with him. The concrete walls had marks on them, scratches like someone had been counting days, and in one corner someone had carved, "Help me," in jagged letters. My wedding ring was gone, my phone was gone, my purse with our cash and cards. Everything gone except the clothes I'd fallen asleep in. The worst part was the not knowing. Was Brian in another room like this one? Was he looking for me? Was he even still alive? I found myself talking out loud just to hear a voice, even if it was my own, telling myself stories about how he'd escaped and was bringing help, how the FBI was probably already searching for us. But then I'd remember that vacancy sign, how the place wasn't even on GPS, how we hadn't told anyone exactly where we were going that day. My parents thought we were heading to New Mexico. Brian's family knew even less. We'd wanted to be spontaneous, go off the grid for our honeymoon. God, we were so stupid. On what must have been the third or fourth day, the routine changed. Instead of crackers, they slid a sandwich under the door with more water than usual, and the water tasted different, bitter and chemical, like the smell in that hallway at the inn. I tried not to drink it, but the thirst was unbearable in that concrete box. Within an hour, the room started spinning. My limbs went heavy again, and I felt myself sliding back into that same thick darkness. This time, I woke up in the back of a vehicle, bouncing along some rough road. My wrists were zip-tied, mouth taped shut, but I could see through a small window that we were in some kind of van. 2 men sat in the front seats, neither of them Tomas, talking casually in Spanish about soccer scores and weekend plans like they were on any normal work commute. The van smelled like cigarettes and motor oil, and there were other shapes in the darkness with me. Bundles or bags, I couldn't tell. We drove for what felt like hours. Every time I started to focus, to try to remember turns or count minutes, another wave of whatever drug they'd given me would pull me back toward unconsciousness. At some point, I heard one of them make a phone call, mentioning numbers, not names, just numbers, and saying something about the teacher being ready for pickup. That's when it really hit me. I wasn't a person to them anymore, just product with a label, a profession that probably made me seem docile, trustworthy, easy to control. The van stopped suddenly, and I heard shouting outside, different voices, maybe an argument about money from what little Spanish I could understand. One of the men up front cursed, said something about "policía" and "checkpoint," and suddenly they were both out of the van, doors slamming, footsteps running. I waited, heart hammering, for someone to come back, but there was just silence, then distant sirens, getting closer. I started kicking the van walls, screaming through the tape, making as much noise as I could with my bound hands and feet. The sirens got louder and I heard car doors, radio chatter, someone speaking English with a heavy accent calling for backup. When they finally opened the van's back doors, the sunrise blinded me. 2 state troopers stood there, hands on their weapons, looking as shocked as I felt. They cut the zip ties, peeled off the tape, kept asking if I was hurt, where I'd come from, how long I'd been in there. But my brain was still foggy from the drugs, and all I could manage was Brian's name, over and over, begging them to find Brian. They found me on Highway 90, about 200 miles from where we'd stopped at the Desert Rose Inn, though I didn't know that until later. The officers said the van was registered to a fake company, and the men who'd been driving it were nowhere to be found. They took me to a hospital in Del Rio, where I spent 3 days getting the drugs out of my system and trying to make sense of what happened. The FBI got involved, said the inn was a known waypoint for trafficking operations, that they'd been investigating it for months, but could never get enough evidence. Rosa, Tomas, Carmen. None of those were their real names, and by the time law enforcement got to the inn, the place was abandoned, cleared out like nobody had ever been there at all. They found Brian 5 days later, wandering along a road near Laredo, dehydrated and confused but alive. He'd been kept in a warehouse with 6 other men, all being prepared for forced labor trafficking to farms across the border. He escaped when one of the guards got drunk and forgot to lock a door properly. We were lucky, they told us. Most people who disappear into these operations are never found, especially not alive and relatively unharmed. The GPS kept recalculating, its robotic voice cutting through the silence every few minutes as we climbed higher into the Rockies. Kevin had his hand on my knee, tapping along to some old rock song on the radio, while I watched the pine trees blur past my window. We'd left California that morning with the windows down and music blasting, still giddy from our wedding 3 days earlier. His parents had given us a week at their timeshare in Colorado as a wedding gift, and instead of taking the boring interstate route, we decided to let technology pick the scenic path. Every time the GPS offered a shortcut through the mountains, we took it, laughing about being adventurous newlyweds who weren't afraid of a little detour. By late afternoon, we were on a narrow road I couldn't even find a name for, surrounded by walls of rock on one side and a drop into nothing on the other. The grinding started subtle at first, like metal scraping against metal somewhere beneath the hood. Kevin turned down the radio, that little crease appearing between his eyebrows whenever something worried him. Within minutes, the sound got louder, angrier, and the steering wheel started fighting against his grip. He managed to wrestle the car into a small gravel pullout just as smoke began seeping from under the hood. The engine coughed once and died. I remember the sudden quiet after that, how you could hear the wind whistling through the canyon and nothing else. No traffic, no birds, just wind. Kevin tried his phone first, then mine. Neither had a single bar of service. The last car we'd seen had passed us maybe an hour ago, heading the opposite direction. The sun was already dipping behind the peaks, and I could see my breath when I stepped outside. We'd been standing there for maybe 20 minutes, Kevin with his head buried under the hood, pretending he knew what he was looking at, when we heard the truck. It came around the bend slow, its diesel engine echoing off the canyon walls long before we saw it. An old 18-wheeler, the kind with a sleeping cab attached, rust eating through the white paint job in places. It pulled up behind our car and sat there idling for what felt like too long before the driver killed the engine. The door opened with a squeal, and this massive guy climbed down. He must have been 6'4" at least, wearing coveralls that looked like they hadn't been washed in weeks. His beard was streaked with gray and hung down to his chest, but it was his eyes that made me step closer to Kevin. They were this pale, watery blue, and they never seemed to blink. He looked at me first, then at Kevin, then back at me, and his mouth stretched into this wide grin that showed too many teeth. "Engine trouble?" he asked, but he was already walking toward us before we answered, his boots crunching on the gravel. His voice had this strange quality to it, soft but somehow invasive, like it was getting inside your head without permission. Kevin explained about the grinding noise and the steering, and the guy nodded along, but he never looked at Kevin while he listened. His eyes stayed on me, traveling from my face down to my feet and back up again, real slow and deliberate. I pulled my jacket tighter and moved behind Kevin, but the driver just shifted his position so he could keep watching me. "Name's Walter," he said, extending a hand toward Kevin but still staring at me. "I know these roads like the veins in my arms. Been driving them for 37 years, since before they even paved some of these stretches. Your lucky day I came along. Ain't nobody else gonna pass through here until morning, maybe later." Walter insisted on looking at the engine himself, waving Kevin aside with one meaty hand. He bent over the hood, making these humming sounds while he poked around, occasionally asking Kevin to try starting it. Each time the engine failed to turn over, Walter would straighten up and look directly at me, like he was checking to make sure I was still there. After the fourth attempt, he wiped his hands on his coveralls, leaving fresh grease stains on top of old ones. "Alternator's shot, maybe the serpentine belt too," he announced, scratching his beard. "Got some tools in my truck, might be able to get you going enough to limp to the next town, about 40 miles from here." He paused, tilting his head at me. "Course the lady might want to sit in my cab while we work. Getting mighty cold out here and I got heat, some coffee in a thermos. Real fresh, made it this morning." Kevin started to say I was fine, but Walter cut him off with this laugh that sounded like gravel in a blender. "Wasn't talking to you, friend," he said, still smiling but with something harder in his voice. "Lady can speak for herself, can't she? Besides, this kind of work, it's gonna take some time, maybe an hour, maybe two. No sense in her freezing out here watching us get our hands dirty." He took a step toward me and I could smell him. Diesel fuel, stale cigarettes, and something else. Something sour and wrong. "Got some sandwiches too. Bet you folks haven't eaten since lunch. The hunger gets to you up in these mountains. Makes you weak. Makes you see things that aren't there. Best to keep your strength up." His hand reached out like he was going to touch my arm, and Kevin moved between us. But Walter just chuckled and let his hand drop. Protective husband. That's sweet. But these mountains got a way of changing people. You'll see. For the next hour, I watched them work while trying to stay warm, pacing back and forth on the gravel shoulder. Walter had produced a toolbox from his truck that looked ancient, full of instruments I couldn't name. some of them caked with what looked like dried mud or maybe rust. Every few minutes, he'd send Kevin to fetch something from the truck, a different wrench, a flashlight, a rag. And during those moments when Kevin was gone, Walter would stop working entirely. He'd just stand there watching me, wiping his hands slow and deliberate on a dirty cloth. "You remind me of someone," he said during one of these moments, his voice barely above a whisper. "Had the same color hair, same way of standing with your arms crossed. She came through here too, about 3 winters back. Never did find out what happened to her after her husband's car broke down." He smiled at my expression. "Mountains keep their secrets real good up here. Sometimes the snow melts in spring and hikers find things. Sometimes it doesn't." The temperature kept dropping and my fingers were going numb despite my gloves. Kevin's face had turned red from the cold and frustration as nothing they tried seemed to work. Walter suggested more and more elaborate fixes, each one requiring tools that happened to be deeper in his truck, sending Kevin further away for longer periods. During one of these trips, Walter moved closer to me than he'd been all evening, close enough that I had to take a step back against our car. "Your husband doesn't know much about engines," he said, his breath forming clouds between us. "City boy, right? They never learn the important things. How to fix what's broken. How to survive when things go wrong. How to keep the people they love from disappearing." His hand came up again, and this time he actually touched my hair, just a quick brush of his fingers, but it made my whole body go rigid. "So soft," he murmured. "Just like I thought it would be. You really should get in my truck, it's getting dangerous out here. Temperature's gonna drop another 20 degrees before midnight. You could die from exposure. Wouldn't want that pretty face turning blue." When Kevin came back carrying an ancient-looking battery charger, he found Walter standing too close to me, and his face went dark. "Step back," Kevin said, his voice harder than I'd ever heard it. Walter raised both hands in mock surrender, that horrible grin spreading across his face again, but he moved away, slow, deliberate, like he was making a point about who was really in control. "Just trying to help," Walter said, "but seems like this fix ain't working anyway. Battery charger won't do nothing if the alternator's completely fried." He made a big show of checking his watch, an old wind-up thing that looked like it belonged in a museum. "Getting late. Here's what I'm thinking. I got a cabin about 8 miles up the road. Nothing fancy, but it's got heat. Phone that sometimes works. You folks could spend the night, and in the morning I can tow you down to town with my truck, unless you want to spend the night out here." Of course, like I said, temperature's dropping fast. Already below freezing, gonna hit 0 before long. Kevin and I exchanged looks, and I could see him weighing our options. Stay in the car and risk freezing to death, or go with Walter to some isolated cabin. Before we could discuss it, Walter added, "Could just take the lady if you want to stay with your car. Make sure nobody messes with it during the night. These mountains, they get all kinds of folks passing through. Some of them ain't as friendly as me." The way he said friendly made my skin prickle. Kevin immediately said no, we stay together, and Walter shrugged like it didn't matter to him either way. "Follow me then," he said, already walking back to his truck. "Road gets tricky in the dark. Easy to drive right off the edge if you don't know where the turns are. Happened to a family from Nevada last winter. Took 3 days to find them at the bottom of the ravine. The cold had preserved them real nice though, almost like they were sleeping." He climbed into his cab and started the engine, the headlights cutting through the darkness that had settled complete around us. We had no choice but to get back in our car and let Walter tow us with a thick chain he produced from somewhere in his truck. The ride was nightmare-inducing, being pulled through the darkness on a narrow mountain road, our dead car swaying with each turn, completely at Walter's mercy. Kevin kept pumping the brakes to maintain some control, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. Through the rear window of Walter's cab, I could see his silhouette, and sometimes I swear he was looking back at us through his mirrors instead of watching the road. After what felt like hours but was probably 20 minutes, Walter's truck slowed and turned onto a dirt path I wouldn't have seen even in daylight. tree branches scraped against our windows as we were dragged deeper into the forest. Finally, a small structure appeared in the truck's headlights, a wooden cabin that looked like it had been built decades ago and forgotten. No other buildings visible, no lights except what came from Walter's truck, no sign that anyone else had been here in years. Walter unhitched our car and stood there in his headlights, waiting for us to get out. "Home, sweet home," he called out, his voice carrying strange in the thin mountain air. The cabin door wasn't locked, just pushed open when Walter leaned his shoulder against it. Inside, he lit a kerosene lantern that threw wild shadows on the walls, revealing a single room with a wood stove, a table with 3 mismatched chairs, and a bed in the corner covered with what looked like animal pelts. The smell hit me immediately. Must, decay, and something chemical I couldn't identify. Walter started building a fire in the stove, humming that same tuneless sound from before. "Make yourselves comfortable," he said without turning around. "Got some beans in cans, some jerky I dried myself. Bathroom's the outhouse around back, but I wouldn't go out there alone. Had a woman get turned around in the dark last year, wandered into the woods. Found her 2 weeks later, about a mile from here. The animals had gotten to her by then." Kevin put his arm around me, pulling me close, and I could feel him trembling. From cold or fear, I couldn't tell. The next part comes in fragments, like a broken film reel with sections missing. I remember Walter opening a cabinet and pulling out a bottle of something clear, insisting we drink to warm our bones. Kevin refused at first, but Walter's demeanor changed, the fake friendliness dropping away like a mask. "I don't like ungrateful guests," he said, his voice flat and dangerous. "Man offers you shelter from freezing to death. Least you can do is share a drink with him." The liquid burned going down, tasted wrong, medicinal and bitter. Walter watched us drink, then poured another round and another. The room started tilting, the shadows from the lantern becoming alive, writhing on the walls. Kevin was saying something about needing to leave, standing up too fast. And then Walter was between him and the door, so much bigger than I'd realized. There was a struggle. I remember the sound of furniture breaking, Kevin yelling my name, and then a wet crack that made everything go silent. The last clear memory I have is Walter's face close to mine, his breath hot and foul, saying something about how the mountains had chosen me, how I was meant to stay. After that, it's just flashes, being dragged through snow, the cold so intense it felt like burning, branches tearing at my clothes and screaming that might have been mine or might have been the wind. Then nothing, complete blackness. I woke up walking along the highway as the sun was rising, covered in mud and pine needles, my clothes torn, no idea how I'd gotten there. A ranger found me like that, stumbling down the center line, unable to tell him anything except our names. They searched for Kevin for 3 weeks. They found our car at the pullout where it broke down, but no sign of the cabin, no tire tracks from any truck, and no one at any local store or gas station had ever heard of anyone named Walter fitting that description. The only evidence Kevin had ever been there at all was his wedding ring, found in the mud about 50 feet from our car, and scratch marks on a tree nearby that looked like someone had tried to climb it. The investigators kept asking me about the drugs in my system. A veterinary tranquilizer, they said, used for large animals, enough to cause severe memory loss but not enough to kill. They found traces of it in my blood, but nowhere else. No bottle, no syringe, nothing. They brought in search dogs, helicopters, even volunteer groups from 3 counties, but Kevin just vanished into those mountains like he'd never existed. 6 months later, I hired a private investigator who discovered something that still makes me wake up at night in a cold sweat. There had been 4 other couples over the past 15 years. Same story, car trouble on mountain roads. Husband disappears, wife found wandering with no memory and the same drug in her system. All the women described a truck driver, but the details never matched up. Different names, different appearances, like they were describing different people entirely. The FBI got involved after that, said it might be multiple people working the same routes, maybe even people who communicate somehow, but they never found anything solid. I moved across the country, changed my name, tried to start over. but sometimes I still get postcards with no return address. Just photos of mountain roads and 2 words written on the back. Still waiting. I don't know if Kevin is alive somewhere in those mountains, if Walter was real, or if there's something worse out there that my mind won't let me remember. All I know is that I'll never take another mountain road as long as I live, and when people ask me about being a widow, I tell them my husband died in a car accident, because that's easier than explaining that he simply disappeared into thin air while something unspeakable happened to me that my own mind has chosen to erase. The first few days by the Columbia River felt like a dream. The cabin sat close enough to the water that you could hear the current humming against the rocks at night. My wife, Emily, had picked the place after scrolling through endless listings. She wanted somewhere quiet enough to hear her own thoughts, as she said. It was a simple wooden cabin, 1 bedroom, a porch swing, and a trail that wound through tall cedar trees behind it. We spent our evenings cooking together, talking about the future, watching the sun fade behind the hills. It felt peaceful, too peaceful maybe, the kind of quiet that makes you notice every creak in the walls. That night, we went to bed after a long walk by the riverbank. Emily had been laughing about how our shoes kept sinking into the mud, leaving long, uneven prints. I remember her falling asleep before me, one hand resting on my arm. The next thing I knew, I woke up in the gray light of dawn, and her side of the bed was cold. The blanket was folded back neatly like she had just stepped out for a moment. I called her name softly at first, thinking she had gone outside to watch the sunrise. But the cabin stayed silent, except for the steady whisper of the river. When I got up, I noticed the back door was wide open. Cold air drifted inside, carrying the smell of damp earth and pine. Her shoes were still by the door. So was her jacket. Her phone sat on the table, screen dark. That's when something inside me began to tighten, a quiet panic that didn't make sense yet. I walked out to the porch, scanning the clearing. The morning mist hung low over the trees, thick enough that you couldn't see far. But the grass near the steps was pressed down, like someone had walked through recently. I called her name louder, stepping into the mist, barefoot and shivering. The trail behind the cabin looked undisturbed at first glance, just mud and pine needles. Then I noticed a single set of footprints, small ones, hers, leading away from the porch and toward the trees. They stopped abruptly near the edge of the clearing, as if she had vanished mid-step. But when I turned back toward the cabin, I saw something that made my throat tighten. New prints, deep and wet, leading back into the cabin. At first I thought maybe I was seeing things. The prints looked too large to be hers, the soles wider, the stride longer. They led from the back door through the kitchen and stopped right beside the bed where I had been sleeping. The floor was still damp. Tiny bits of moss and grit stuck to the wood. I stood there for what felt like forever, trying to understand what I was looking at. I knew I had locked that door the night before. I always checked twice before sleeping. Someone had come inside while we were both asleep. I called the sheriff's office right away. A deputy showed up within half an hour, an older man named Wallace who looked like he had seen too much in his life to be easily impressed. He walked around the cabin, took a few notes, and shrugged. "People wander off all the time near the river," he said, like it was the most ordinary thing in the world. I told him about the footprints, both sets, but he barely glanced at them, said the mud could play tricks on the eyes. When he left, he promised to send someone to look around, but I could tell he didn't believe a word I'd said. That afternoon, I went searching on my own. The forest behind the cabin stretched for miles, thick with cedar and ferns that brushed against your clothes as you passed. The air had that heavy, quiet weight that makes every sound stand out. A snapping twig, a crow's call, your own breathing. I followed what I thought were her tracks deeper into the woods, but they started to overlap with others, larger ones, and then smaller again, circling back toward the cabin. It was like more than one person had been walking there, tracing the same path again and again. By dusk, I was back at the cabin, exhausted and covered in mud. The deputy hadn't returned. I went inside to wash up and noticed something strange near the window. A faint smudge on the glass, like a handprint pressed from the outside. I wiped it with a towel and felt the chill of the glass beneath my fingers. And that's when I noticed a faint shape on the tree line, just far enough away that I couldn't see its face. Someone was standing there, still as stone, watching the cabin. When I blinked, they were gone. I barely slept that night. Every time the wind moved through the trees, it sounded like footsteps. I sat up on the couch with the lights off, watching the dark outline of the forest through the window. Around midnight, the porch boards creaked softly, one by one, like someone testing their weight. I didn't move, I just listened. Then came a slow drag across the wood, the unmistakable sound of something wet being pulled. By the time I gathered the courage to flip on the porch light, the sound had stopped, and the only thing out there was a trail of mud leading down the steps. At sunrise, I went straight back outside. The mud trail ended near the water, where the soil gave way to rocks. That's when I noticed something half buried near the riverbank. A piece of fabric caught on a root. It was the sleeve of Emily's flannel shirt, torn clean through. I shouted her name again and again, but the wind carried the sound away. I felt like I was shouting into nothing. When I turned back, I realized there were more footprints along the shore. Not just 2 sets now, 4, maybe 5, crossing over one another, some heading toward the forest, some coming back. It looked like a crowd had passed through while I slept. When the sheriff finally returned later that morning, I showed him everything. He walked around with that same bored expression, then told me I might be seeing patterns that aren't there. He said people disappear near the river more often than folks realize. Hikers, campers, travelers. The water takes what it wants, he muttered, almost like a habit. Before leaving, he warned me not to wander alone. I asked if he believed she could still be alive. He didn't answer. That evening, I packed our things and left. I drove until the river was far behind me, but I still see that cabin every time I close my eyes. Some nights I dream I'm back there, standing at the doorway, watching muddy footprints form on the floorboards, one after another, like someone invisible is still pacing around that room. Emily's case is still marked as missing. They never found her, but sometimes, when it rains, I swear I can smell that same damp cedar air and hear the sound of footsteps just outside my window. Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. Now, let's begin. October 31st, 2016 was supposed to be just another easy night of making extra cash. I was 19, a sophomore at the local community college, and babysitting for the Bradshaw family had become my regular weekend gig. They lived in one of those quiet suburban neighborhoods where the biggest drama was usually someone forgetting to bring their trash cans in. Mr. and Mrs. Bradshaw were heading to some fancy corporate Halloween party downtown, and they needed someone to watch their 2 kids, Jamie, who was 8, and little Sophia, barely 5. The pay was good, $50 plus whatever leftovers they had in the fridge, and the kids were usually asleep by 9 anyway. I remember thinking it would be the easiest money I'd ever make, just sitting there watching Netflix while handing out candy to trick-or-treaters. The Bradshaws left around 7:30, Mrs. Bradshaw doing that typical parent thing, where she wrote down 5 different phone numbers, even though I already had her cell saved in my contacts. The kids were hyped up on pre-Halloween candy their grandma had sent them, running around in their costumes. Jamie was some superhero I didn't recognize. and Sophia was a princess with a tiara that kept sliding off her head. I managed to corral them onto the couch with the promise of watching Hocus Pocus, and for about an hour, everything was completely normal. Trick-or-treaters came in waves, groups of kids with pillowcases and plastic pumpkins, parents hovering at the end of the driveway with flashlights. I was actually enjoying myself, remembering how much fun Halloween used to be when I was their age, before everything got complicated with college applications and part-time jobs and all that adult stuff that suddenly seemed to matter so much. Around 9 o'clock, after I'd gotten both kids into their pajamas and tucked into Jamie's room, Sophia insisted on sleeping in her brother's bed during scary nights. I noticed this person in a clown costume standing at the corner of the property, right where the Bradshaw's lawn met the sidewalk. At first, I didn't think much of it. Halloween brings out all kinds of weird costumes, and teenagers especially love going overboard with the creepy stuff. But this clown wasn't moving with a group, wasn't carrying a candy bag, wasn't doing anything really except standing there. The costume itself was disturbing in its simplicity. A dirty white jumpsuit with pom-poms down the front, and this mask that even from the living room window I could tell was different from the cheap ones they sell at party stores. The features were too elongated, the smile too wide, painted in this faded red that looked brown under the streetlight. I texted my boyfriend Nathan around 9:15. "There's this creepy clown outside the house I'm babysitting at. He's just standing there." Nathan, being Nathan, immediately called me instead of texting back, and I remember whispering into the phone even though the kids were upstairs and couldn't hear me. He told me to call the cops if the guy didn't leave soon, but I felt stupid making that call. What was I going to say that someone in a Halloween costume was standing on a public sidewalk? While I was talking to Nathan, I walked from room to room, checking all the windows, and that's when I realized the clown wasn't just standing in one spot anymore. He was walking a slow circle around the house, maintaining the same distance from the walls, like he was tracing some invisible boundary. Each window I looked through, I'd catch a glimpse of him passing by, that mask turning slightly toward the house each time, never fully facing forward, always keeping the house in his peripheral vision. Nathan stayed on the phone with me for another 20 minutes, and during that time, the clown completed maybe 3 full circles around the house. I started timing them. Each lap took about 6 minutes, always the same pace, never speeding up or slowing down. The trick-or-treaters had thinned out by then, just the occasional group of older kids without costumes looking for last-minute candy, and none of them seemed to notice or care about the clown. I kept thinking maybe it was some elaborate prank. Maybe one of the Bradshaw's neighbors hired someone to add atmosphere to the neighborhood or something. But there was something mechanical about his movement, something practiced and deliberate that made my chest feel tight. I told Nathan I was going to try something, and I turned off the porch light, the universal signal that we were out of candy. The clown stopped mid-stride when the light went out, stood perfectly still for maybe 10 seconds, then continued his circle like nothing had happened. By 9:45, I was genuinely scared. I double-checked all the locks, closed all the curtains except for a small gap I was using to watch him, and I'd moved into the kitchen where I could see both the front and back doors. Nathan was trying to keep me calm, suggesting maybe the guy was high or drunk, just some weirdo who would eventually get bored and leave. But then I noticed something that made me actually gasp out loud. The clown had something in his hand that I hadn't seen before, or maybe he'd just pulled it out. It was a phone, and he was holding it up, not like he was texting or calling someone, but like he was recording. He was filming the house as he walked, the phone's screen casting this sick blue glow on the lower part of his mask. I immediately thought about the kids upstairs, about how their room faced the street, and I ran up to make sure their curtains were closed. They were both sleeping soundly, Jamie sprawled out with one arm hanging off the bed, Sophia curled up against him sucking her thumb. I stood there for a moment, listening to their breathing, wondering if I should wake them up and bring them downstairs with me. I decided against waking the kids. They were safer not knowing what was happening, I figured. When I got back to the kitchen, Nathan was practically yelling through the phone, asking if I was okay because I'd gone quiet for too long. I told him about the filming, and that's when he said he was coming over. He lived about 15 minutes away, and I remember feeling both relieved and more anxious somehow, like his coming over made this whole thing more real, more serious. I gave him the address again, even though he'd dropped me off there before, and then I went back to my spot by the kitchen window. The clown had changed his pattern. Instead of walking continuous circles, he would now stop at each corner of the house and stand there for exactly 30 seconds. I counted, before moving to the next corner. At each stop, he would slowly turn his head from left to right. That phone held steady, recording everything. 10:13 is when everything went wrong. I remember the exact time because I was texting Nathan asking how far away he was, and he said he was parking down the street because he didn't want to pull into the driveway and potentially escalate things with the clown. I was typing back, "Please hurry," when I heard the basement door open. Not the outside basement door, the one inside the house, the one that connected the basement to the hallway near the bathroom. My whole body went rigid. The Bradshaws had mentioned that door sometimes didn't latch properly, that you really had to push it closed, but I knew I hadn't been in the basement at all that night. I stood there in the kitchen, phone in one hand, a knife from the drawer in the other. When had I grabbed that? Listening to footsteps that were definitely coming from inside the house. Slow, deliberate steps, not trying to be quiet exactly, but not making extra noise either. The footsteps stopped at the bottom of the main stairs, the ones that led up to where the kids were sleeping, and I knew I had to move. I dropped my phone on the kitchen counter. It made this awful clattering sound that seemed impossibly loud, and ran for the stairs. My socks slipped on the hardwood floor as I rounded the corner, and I could hear those footsteps behind me now, faster, taking the stairs 2 at a time. I burst into Jamie's room and slammed the door behind me, turning the lock with shaking fingers. The kids woke up confused, Sophia starting to cry, and I pulled them both into Jamie's closet, whispering that we were playing a game, a Halloween game where we had to hide really quietly. Jamie was old enough to know something was wrong, his eyes wide in the darkness of the closet, but he held his sister tight and didn't say a word. Through the closet door, I could hear footsteps in the hallway, slow again, stopping at each door. The handle of Jamie's room jiggled once, twice, then nothing. Just breathing on the other side of the door, raspy and deliberately loud, like whoever it was wanted us to know they were there. The silence stretched out for what felt like hours but was probably only 2 or 3 minutes. Then I heard Nathan's voice from downstairs, shouting my name, saying the front door was wide open. The footsteps in the hallway moved fast then, running toward the stairs, and I heard Nathan yell something I couldn't make out, followed by what sounded like furniture falling over. I wanted to leave the closet, wanted to help, but Sophia was clinging to me so tight I could barely breathe, and Jamie was whispering, "Don't leave us, please don't leave us," over and over. We heard more crashing, the sound of glass breaking, Nathan's voice getting more distant like he was chasing someone outside. Then suddenly everything went quiet. Not normal quiet. That awful, heavy kind of quiet where you can hear your own heartbeat and nothing else. I kept the kids in that closet for another 15 minutes, until we heard sirens and saw red and blue lights flashing through the bedroom window. Only then did I open the closet door, carrying Sophia while Jamie held onto the back of my shirt, and we made our way downstairs to where 2 police officers were standing in the destroyed living room. Nathan sitting on the couch with a bloody nose, and no sign of anyone in a clown costume anywhere. The police searched the entire neighborhood that night, but they never found whoever was in that clown costume. Nathan told them he'd chased the person through the backyard and into the wooded area behind the houses, but lost them in the darkness. The really disturbing part came when they checked the basement. The lock on the exterior basement door had been picked, and there were muddy footprints showing someone had been down there for a while. Maybe even before I arrived that evening. They found my phone in the kitchen where I'd left it, still recording a video I didn't remember starting. When the detective played it back, you could hear me talking to Nathan. Then the door opening, my footsteps running, and then about 4 minutes of just breathing. That same raspy breathing I'd heard outside Jamie's door. The Bradshaws came home to find their house swarming with police, and Mrs. Bradshaw just held her kids and cried, while Mr. Bradshaw kept apologizing to me, like any of this was somehow their fault. They moved out 3 months later, said they couldn't stand being in that house anymore. For years I had nightmares about that mask, about those mechanical circles around the house, about what would have happened if Nathan hadn't shown up when he did. I moved away for college, tried to put it all behind me, but Halloween always brought it back. Then, about 2 years ago, I got a call from Nathan. He still lived in our hometown, had actually bought a house about 6 blocks from where the Bradshaws used to live. He was doing some landscaping in his backyard, planning to put in a pool, when his shovel hit something hard about 3 feet down. It was wrapped in plastic, a garbage bag duct-taped into a bundle. Inside was that clown mask, unmistakable with its elongated features and faded red smile, along with a white jumpsuit and something else that made Nathan call the police immediately, a notebook filled with addresses, dates, and detailed observations about families in the neighborhood. The Bradshaws' address was there, along with notes about their schedule, their kids' names, my name, what time I usually arrived and left. But here's what still keeps me up at night. Their entry was from 2016, but the newest entries were from just weeks before Nathan found it. Someone had been using that same mask, that same method, still watching families, still taking notes. The police took everything as evidence, but they never found who buried it there. Nathan sold that house within a month, didn't even wait to get his asking price. Neither of us talks about it anymore, but every Halloween, we text each other just to check in, just to make sure we're both okay, both safe, both nowhere near any windows where someone might be walking slow circles outside, recording everything, waiting for the right moment to test a basement door. Halloween 2022 changed everything for me. I was a senior at the state university, majoring in journalism, and I'd been covering campus stories for the student paper since freshman year. That October night started like any other Halloween weekend. Costume parties everywhere, drunk students stumbling around downtown, the usual chaos. I wasn't even supposed to be working that night, but our regular photographer, Kevin, had called in sick at the last minute. The editor asked if I could cover the big costume party at the Vault, this converted bank building that served as the hottest club near campus. I grabbed my camera, threw on a lazy vampire costume, just fangs and a cape over regular clothes, and headed downtown around 10 p.m. The streets were packed with zombies, witches, superheroes, everyone trying to outdo each other with their costumes. The party was exactly what you'd expect. Wall-to-wall people, terrible music, overpriced drinks. I spent about 2 hours taking photos of costume contest winners and drunk kids making fools of themselves. Around midnight, I noticed this guy in an incredibly detailed plague doctor mask. You know, those bird-like masks with the long beaks that medieval doctors wore during the Black Death. But this wasn't some cheap Halloween store version. The leather looked aged and authentic, with brass fixtures and glass eyepieces that reflected the strobe lights in this unsettling way. He was tall, maybe 6'2", wearing a long black coat that seemed way too heavy for the warm October weather we were having. What really caught my attention was how he moved through the crowd. People seemed to unconsciously step aside when he walked by, creating this bubble of space around him that felt wrong in such a packed venue. I raised my camera to get a shot of the costume, but when I looked through the viewfinder, he was staring directly at me through those glass lenses. I lowered the camera and he was gone, just vanished into the crowd like smoke. That should have been my first warning, but I brushed it off. People move fast in clubs, especially when they're drunk. I kept shooting photos for another hour until I ran into my roommate Jordan, who was dressed as some anime character I didn't recognize. He was completely wasted, barely able to stand, and his girlfriend Melissa was trying to convince him to leave. She asked if I could help her get him back to our apartment since it was on my way home anyway. We basically carried Jordan out of the club around 1:30 a.m., each of us supporting one of his arms while he mumbled about wanting pizza. The downtown area was still buzzing with people, but as we turned onto Riverside Avenue, the crowds thinned out. That's when I saw the plague doctor again, standing under a streetlight about a block ahead of us, perfectly still, facing our direction. Melissa noticed him too and made some joke about creepy dudes on Halloween. But something about the way he stood there made my chest tighten. We turned down Crawford Street to avoid walking past him. It was a shortcut anyway, cutting through this older part of downtown where they hadn't updated the streetlights yet. The street was darker than usual because several lights were out, and the shadows from the working ones created these long, distorted shapes on the pavement. Jordan had gone quiet, his head lolling forward as we dragged him along. About halfway down the block, Melissa's phone rang, her sister calling to make sure she got home safe. She let go of Jordan to answer, and I had to grab him with both arms to keep him from falling. That's when I heard footsteps behind us, slow and deliberate, the sound of heavy boots on concrete. I turned around and saw that plague doctor mask again, maybe 30 feet back, just walking steadily in our direction. I told Melissa we needed to move faster, but she was still on the phone, not paying attention. Jordan chose that exact moment to throw up all over his anime costume and my shoes, the smell of cheap beer and whatever he'd eaten hitting me instantly. While I was trying to keep him upright and not gag myself, Melissa finally hung up and started freaking out about Jordan's condition. We needed to stop and let him catch his breath, so we propped him against a brick wall next to this abandoned print shop that had been closed for years. The windows were boarded up with plywood that had graffiti tags I recognized from around campus. I kept glancing back, but the plague doctor had stopped too, maintaining that same 30-foot distance, just standing there in the middle of the sidewalk. The weird part was how patient he seemed, not approaching, not leaving, just waiting. Under the broken streetlight, I could barely make out his silhouette, but those glass eyepieces somehow caught what little light there was, creating 2 pinpoints of reflection that never moved away from us. Melissa was digging through her purse for tissues to clean Jordan up when we heard voices coming from the other end of Crawford Street. A group of people laughing and singing, probably heading home from another party. Relief washed through me because witnesses meant safety, right? But as the group got closer, I realized they were all wearing masks too. A wolf, a Jason hockey mask, something that looked like melted flesh, and another plague doctor mask, though cheaper looking than the one following us. They walked past us without acknowledging we were there, even though Jordan was actively dry heaving against the wall, and Melissa was practically yelling at him to drink some water. The group just flowed around us like we were invisible, their laughter continuing uninterrupted. When I looked back again, our plague doctor had moved closer, maybe 15 feet now, and 2 more figures had joined him, both in different but equally elaborate masks. One looked like a Victorian porcelain doll face. The other was some kind of demon with curved horns. That's when panic really set in. I grabbed Jordan under his arms and basically started dragging him forward while Melissa kept asking what was wrong. I couldn't form words to explain that 3 people in masks were following us and getting closer with each passing second. We stumbled forward, Jordan's feet barely helping, his weight making every step a struggle. The end of Crawford Street opened onto Washington Boulevard, where there should have been traffic, more people, safety. But when we reached the intersection, the usually busy boulevard was completely empty. No cars, no pedestrians, no sound except our own ragged breathing and Jordan's incoherent mumbling. The traffic lights were still changing from green to yellow to red, illuminating the empty asphalt in shifting colors, but there was nothing to direct. I could hear those footsteps getting closer, multiple sets now, no longer trying to match our pace but gaining on us. Melissa finally turned around and saw them. Her scream cut through the silence like breaking glass. We ran, or tried to run with Jordan barely conscious between us. We made it maybe half a block down Washington before Jordan's legs completely gave out and we had to stop. The masked figures had spread out behind us, no longer walking in a group but forming a semicircle that was slowly closing in. That's when I noticed others stepping out from doorways and alleys ahead of us. More masks, different styles, but all elaborate and disturbing. A cracked baby doll face with one eye missing, a leather mask with zippers for features, something that looked like exposed muscle and sinew. They moved with this horrible synchronization, like they'd rehearsed this exact scenario. Melissa was crying, begging them to leave us alone, offering money, her phone, anything. But they never spoke, never made any sound except their footsteps. The original plague doctor raised one gloved hand and pointed at Jordan, then made a beckoning motion with his fingers. The message was clear. They wanted him. I don't know what made me do it, but I pulled out my phone and started recording video, thinking maybe evidence would help later. Maybe someone would believe us. Through the screen, I saw something that made my knees weak. Jordan wasn't Jordan anymore. Where my roommate's face should have been, there was a blank, smooth surface, like skin stretched over where features should be. No eyes, no mouth, no nose, just flesh-colored nothing. Melissa saw my phone screen and looked down at what we were holding between us. Her scream this time was different, raw terror mixed with confusion. But when I looked directly at Jordan without the phone, his face was normal again, drunk and pale, but definitely there. I lifted the phone back up, and through the camera, that horrible blank face returned. The masked figures had stopped moving, apparently waiting for us to understand something. I switched to the front-facing camera and nearly dropped the phone. Melissa and I looked normal, but behind us, the street wasn't Crawford anymore. Through the phone screen, we were standing in some kind of warehouse or factory, with rusted metal walls and industrial equipment I couldn't identify. The plague doctor tilted his head, almost like he was amused, then reached up and removed his mask. Underneath was just a normal guy, maybe late 20s, with stubble and tired eyes. One by one, the others removed their masks too. Regular people, different ages, different ethnicities, but all with this exhausted, resigned expression. The man who'd worn the plague doctor mask spoke for the first time, his voice rough like he hadn't used it in a while. He's already gone. Has been since you left the club. What you're carrying is just an echo, and it's drawing them here. Every Halloween, they send out echoes wearing faces, looking for specific people. You can keep dragging that thing around, but it's not your friend anymore. He pulled out an old flip phone, checked the time, and continued. In about 3 minutes, that echo is going to walk back to where it came from, and if you're still holding on to it when it does, you'll go too. We've been trying to warn people for years, but the masks are the only way we can see each other, the only way we can move through the spaces where the echoes hunt. Melissa was sobbing, saying this was insane, that Jordan was right there. We could see him. But I believed the man because something deep in my gut had been screaming wrongness since we'd left the club. The plague doctor man tossed me a rubber Halloween mask, a cheap werewolf one from a dollar store. "Put it on and look at your friend again," he said. "Then decide if you want to let go." With shaking fingers, I pulled the mask over my head. Through the eye holes, Jordan wasn't there at all. Just a column of static, like television snow in human shape, and where his feet should have touched the ground, there was nothing, just empty space. Worse, I could see thin, translucent threads extending from the static thing into both Melissa and me, wrapped around our wrists like fishing line. The masked people weren't people anymore either. Through the werewolf mask, they looked like burn victims, with melted, scarred skin and missing pieces, but their eyes were kind, desperate even. 60 seconds, the man said, his voice distorted now through my mask-filtered perception. "Drop it and run. Don't look back, don't go home tonight, and whatever you do, don't answer if someone calls your name." Melissa and I let go of Jordan at the same time. The moment we did, the static thing stood perfectly upright on its own, turned and began walking back toward Crawford Street with mechanical precision. We ran in the opposite direction, our feet slapping against wet pavement I didn't remember being wet before. Behind us, I heard the masked people scattering, their footsteps fading in different directions. We ran for blocks until we reached the 24-hour diner on Peachtree. Bright lights and normal people everywhere. Melissa collapsed in a booth, hyperventilating, while I called 911 to report Jordan missing. The police found him 3 hours later, wandering downtown in his ruined costume with no memory of anything after midnight. He was fine, completely fine, except for one thing. He swore he'd been at his parents' house in Ohio the whole time, that he'd never even come back to campus after fall break. Security footage from the vault showed him at the party, but every camera that should have caught him on Crawford Street just showed static from 1:47 to 1:50 a.m. The really screwed up part? When I developed the photos from my camera the next day, every shot I'd taken of the plague doctor at the club showed a different person's face in that mask. And in the background of each one, there was always someone in a regular Halloween mask watching. I'd been counting down the days until I could leave my hometown since junior year of high school, and finally making it to State University felt like stepping into a whole different world. I'd been there for about 2 months when Halloween rolled around, and I was still that awkward freshman who ate most of her meals alone in the dining hall. My roommate had gone home for the weekend, leaving me with nothing but a pile of homework and a bag of fun-sized Snickers I'd bought for myself. I was sitting in the library that afternoon, October 31st, trying to focus on my psychology textbook when these 3 girls from my English Lit class approached my table. We'd done a group project together a few weeks earlier, but I wouldn't say we were friends, just the kind of acquaintances who smile and wave when you pass each other on campus. The one who did most of the talking was Ashley, this bubbly blonde who always wore designer everything, and somehow managed to look put together even at 8 in the morning. She leaned against my table and asked if I had plans for tonight, and when I said no, her face lit up like she'd just won something. They were going to this exclusive Halloween party at a house off campus, she explained, and the host specifically asked them to bring more people because a bunch of guests had canceled last minute. The other 2 girls, whose names I'm pretty sure were Chloe and Madison, but I honestly couldn't remember for certain, stood behind her nodding and smiling. Ashley showed me the address on her phone, 47882 Garrison Road, about 15 minutes from campus, and said to be there at 9, costume optional since it was such short notice. I remember feeling this little spark of excitement, thinking maybe this was finally my chance to break into the social scene I'd been watching from the sidelines. Around 4 that afternoon, I was walking from the library to my dorm when I noticed this guy behind me. He had on a gray hoodie with the hood up, dark jeans, and these beat-up red Converse that made this weird squeaking sound every few steps. At first I didn't think much of it. Campus was always crowded. But then I took a detour through the student union to grab a coffee, and when I came out 20 minutes later, there he was again, maybe 30 feet behind me. Same squeaky shoes, same hunched way of walking, like he was trying to make himself smaller. I ducked into the campus bookstore and pretended to browse the school spirit section for a good 10 minutes, watching the entrance through the corner of my eye. He never came in, and when I finally left, I didn't see him anywhere. I convinced myself I was being paranoid, that it was just some student who happened to be going the same direction. I spent way too long getting ready that night, changing outfits 3 times before settling on black jeans and this vintage band tee I'd found at a thrift store, figuring it was casual enough not to look like I was trying too hard but still appropriate for a party. The Uber driver had trouble finding the address at first, driving up and down Garrison Road twice before finally spotting the house numbers hidden behind an overgrown hedge. The house itself was one of those modern rental places that looked like it belonged in a magazine. All glass and sharp angles, with those automatic lights that turn on when you walk up the driveway. Music was thumping from inside, but something seemed weird about the windows. They all had these heavy blackout curtains drawn tight, not a single gap to see inside. Ashley's white BMW was parked out front though, or at least I thought it was hers. Same model, same sorority sticker on the back windshield. So I paid the driver and headed up to the front door. The door opened before I could even knock, And there was Madison wearing cat ears and holding a red Solo cup, giving me this huge smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. The music was louder inside, but not party loud. More like someone had just turned on a playlist to fill the silence, and the living room only had maybe 12 people scattered around, not the packed party I'd been expecting. Ashley waved from across the room where she was talking to some guy I didn't recognize, and Chloe was nowhere to be seen. The house had that sterile feel of a rental. Generic artwork on the walls, no family photos, that kind of aggressively neutral furniture that's meant to offend nobody and ends up feeling like nobody lives there at all. Madison handed me a drink without asking what I wanted, something pink and way too sweet that burned going down, and started introducing me to people whose names immediately slipped out of my head because I was too busy trying to figure out why everyone seemed to be watching me without actually looking directly at me. That's when I saw him in the kitchen, leaning against the counter and peeling the label off a beer bottle with his thumbnail. The guy from earlier, still in the same gray hoodie, those red Converse visible even from across the room. My whole body went rigid, and I must have made some kind of noise because Madison grabbed my arm and asked if I was okay, her fingers pressing harder than necessary into my skin. I tried to casually ask who he was, and she got this confused look and said his name was Brandon, Ashley's cousin from out of town who'd crashed the party last minute. But here's the thing. When I'd done that group project with Ashley, she'd spent half the time complaining about being an only child with no cousins, no extended family at all, just her and her divorced parents. I excused myself to find the bathroom, needing a minute to think, and Madison pointed down a hallway saying it was the last door on the right, still gripping my arm like she didn't want to let go. The hallway was darker than it should have been, with only one dim bulb at the far end, and I passed 3 closed doors before reaching the bathroom. Inside, I locked the door and immediately tried calling my roommate, but my phone had no signal, not even 1 bar, which made no sense because we were still in the city. I tried connecting to Wi-Fi, but the only network that showed up was password protected with a name that was just random numbers and letters. My heart was hammering so hard I could hear it in my ears, and when I splashed cold water on my face, I noticed my reflection looked wrong in the mirror. It was one of those 2-way mirrors, the kind where the reflection seems slightly darker, slightly off. I pressed my face close to the glass, cupping my hands around my eyes, and I swear I could see the faint outline of a room on the other side. That's when I heard footsteps stop right outside the bathroom door, and someone tried the handle, jiggling it when they found it locked. "Everything okay in there?" It was a man's voice I didn't recognize. Definitely not Brandon's because I'd heard him talking to someone when I'd walked past the kitchen. The handle jiggled again, more insistent this time, and then I heard keys jingling. Keys. Why would someone have keys to the bathroom at a party? I looked around frantically for another exit, but there was just a tiny window above the shower, barely big enough for a cat to squeeze through. "Just a minute," I called out, trying to keep my voice steady while I opened the bathroom cabinet, searching for anything I could use as a weapon. Nothing but toilet paper and cleaning supplies. The key sound stopped, followed by whispering I couldn't make out, and then footsteps walking away. I waited another full minute before cracking the door open, and the hallway was empty, but now all 3 of those previously closed doors were standing wide open, revealing dark rooms that seemed to be watching me. I knew I had to get out of that house immediately, but when I walked back toward the living room, the layout seemed different somehow. The hallway felt longer, and there was a turn I didn't remember taking before. The music had stopped completely, replaced by this low murmur of voices that sounded rehearsed, like people reading from a script. When I finally reached the living room, everyone had rearranged themselves. They were all sitting now, facing the front door in these neat little rows like they were waiting for something. Ashley stood up when she saw me, that same bright smile plastered on her face, and announced to the room that I was ready. Ready for what? I tried to head for the door, but 2 guys I hadn't noticed before stepped in front of it, both of them bigger than football players, just standing there with their arms crossed. Brandon had moved from the kitchen and was now sitting on the arm of a couch, those red sneakers tapping against the floor in this rhythm that made my teeth hurt. "Your Uber already left," Ashley said, walking toward me with her phone in her hand, showing me the app like that proved something. "But don't worry, we've arranged another ride for you." That's when I noticed everyone else had their phones out too, all of them pointed at me, recording. The little red lights on their screens looked like eyes in the dim room, and I realized with absolute clarity that whatever they had planned, they wanted it documented. I backed up until I hit the wall, my mind racing through options. The back door, but I could see through to the kitchen where 3 more people were standing guard. The windows, but those blackout curtains were probably there for a reason. And even if I could get through one, I had no idea what was on the other side. Madison and Chloe flanked Ashley now, all 3 of them moving closer in this synchronized way that made them look like hunters who'd done this before. "We've been watching you for weeks," Ashley said, her voice different now, emptied of that fake sweetness. "You walk the same routes, eat at the same places, sit in the same spot in the library. You made it so easy." That's when I did the only thing I could think of. I grabbed the lamp from the side table next to me, this heavy ceramic thing shaped like a pineapple, and hurled it straight through the front window. The glass exploded outward with this incredible crash that seemed to snap everyone out of their choreographed movements for just a second. And in that second, I ran. Not toward the window I'd just broken. They'd expect that. But straight at the 2 guys blocking the door, screaming at the top of my lungs this primal sound I didn't know I could make. They hesitated, probably not expecting the quiet library girl to charge them like a linebacker, and I dropped down at the last second, sliding between them on the polished floor. My knee hit the door hard, but adrenaline is a hell of a drug, and I was up and fumbling with the deadbolt before they could grab me. The door flew open and I burst out into the night still screaming, and that's what saved me. The neighbors. Turns out the house next door was having their own Halloween party. A real one, with 40 or 50 people who came pouring out when they heard the window break and me screaming like I was being murdered. Brandon tried to follow me out, but stopped dead when he saw all those people streaming across the lawn, some of them already on their phones calling 911. I collapsed on the neighbor's driveway, sobbing and trying to explain what had happened. But I didn't need to convince them. They could see Ashley and her group standing in the doorway of the house, all of them still holding their phones, looking like kids caught doing something terrible. The police showed up within minutes, and that's when everything unraveled fast. Turns out the house was an Airbnb rented with a stolen credit card. Ashley and the other 2 girls weren't even students at State University, and Brandon, his real name was Colin, had a record for assault and was violating parole just by being in the state. They found cameras hidden throughout the house, streaming to some website I don't even want to know about. The whole thing was apparently part of some sick streaming game, where people pay to watch staged scenarios with unsuspecting victims. The police said I was lucky. 2 other girls from different colleges had reported similar setups that month, but they hadn't been able to prove anything because the perpetrators always cleaned up and disappeared. This time, they'd gotten sloppy, too confident. They're all in prison now, and I had to testify at the trial, which was its own kind of nightmare. But at least it's over. I finished my freshman year, though I changed dorms and vary my routes everywhere I go now. I still can't hear squeaky shoes without feeling sick, and I definitely don't accept party invitations from anyone I don't know well. But I survived, and that's what matters. Sometimes that's all you can do. Survive and make sure the bastards don't get to do it to anyone else. Halloween night 2018 will permanently live in my brain as the night I realized how vulnerable we really are in our own homes. I was 27 at the time, living with my girlfriend Vanessa in a small 2-bedroom rental house in Springfield, Massachusetts. We'd been together for about 3 years, and life was pretty normal. I worked as an insurance adjuster, she was a dental hygienist, and we had this comfortable routine where we'd cook dinner together most nights and watch terrible reality TV shows until we passed out on the couch. The house itself wasn't anything special, just one of those cookie-cutter builds from the 70s with thin walls and creaky floors, but it was ours for the time being. That Halloween fell on a Wednesday, and Vanessa had been excited about this new Italian place that opened downtown, so we'd made reservations weeks in advance. I remember she wore this deep purple dress that she'd been saving for a special occasion, and I'd actually ironed a button-down shirt for once, which she'd joked about all evening. We left around 6:30, right when the trick-or-treaters were starting to come around, and I'd left our porch light off since we wouldn't be home to hand out candy anyway. Dinner was fantastic. We're talking homemade pasta, wine that was probably too expensive for our budget, and this tiramisu that Vanessa kept saying she wanted to recreate at home. The restaurant had this cozy, dimly lit atmosphere, with fake cobwebs hung up for the holiday, and our waiter was wearing vampire fangs that kept slipping when he talked, which made us laugh every time he came to our table. We stayed longer than we'd planned, probably until around 9:30 or so, just enjoying each other's company without our phones or the TV as a distraction. The drive home took about 15 minutes, and I remember the streets were pretty much empty by then. Most of the kids had gone home, and the neighborhood had that eerie post-Halloween quiet where you could see decorations swaying in people's yards but no actual people anywhere. When we pulled into our driveway, I noticed our next-door neighbor's house was completely dark, which was unusual because old Mr. Brennan usually stayed up late watching his police procedurals with the volume way too loud. Vanessa was humming some song from the restaurant's playlist as we walked up to our front door, and I was fishing for my keys in my jacket pocket, thinking about how I was definitely going to need to take some antacids before bed because of all that rich food. The first thing that hit me when I opened the door was this weird smell. Not terrible, but distinct, like someone had been eating cheap chocolate and those sour gummy candies that kids go crazy for. I stepped inside and flicked on the living room light, and that's when my brain started trying to make sense of what I was seeing. There were candy wrappers everywhere, and I mean everywhere. Snickers wrappers on the coffee table, empty Kit Kat packages on the couch, those little fun-size Milky Way wrappers scattered across our area rug like confetti. My first thought was that maybe we'd left a window open and some bold raccoon had gotten in because we'd had issues with them getting into our trash before. But then I noticed our back door, the one that leads to our tiny excuse for a backyard, was open about 6 inches. Not wide open, not broken or forced, just open, like someone had stepped out for a second and forgotten to close it all the way. Vanessa came in behind me and immediately grabbed my arm, her fingernails digging into my jacket sleeve. "What the hell?" she whispered, and I could hear her voice shaking a little. I told her to stay by the front door while I checked it out, trying to sound way more confident than I actually felt. I walked through the living room carefully, stepping over the wrappers and trying to listen for any sounds. Our house was old enough that you couldn't walk anywhere without the floors announcing your presence, so I was making these soft creaking noises with every step, which made it even harder to hear anything else. The back door was definitely unlocked. I could see the deadbolt was turned to the open position, which meant someone had unlocked it from the inside, not forced it. That detail stuck with me because I'm obsessive about locking doors, always have been, and I know for a fact I'd checked that door before we left. I pushed it open wider with my foot and looked out into the backyard, but it was just darkness and the vague shapes of our pathetic attempt at a garden that had mostly died by September. The motion sensor light we'd installed last spring should have been on, but it wasn't, and I realized someone must have unscrewed the bulb because I could see it was missing from the socket. That's when the situation started feeling a lot less like dumb kids pulled a prank and a lot more like someone planned this. I came back inside and locked the door, sliding the deadbolt as quietly as I could. And that's when I saw the light coming from under the guest room door down the hallway. We never used that room. It was basically storage. Boxes of Vanessa's college textbooks, my old golf clubs that I kept pretending I'd use again, winter clothes in plastic bins, that kind of stuff. The light in there was one of those weak overhead fixtures with a pull chain, and we never turned it on because there was no reason to. I felt this wave of adrenaline hit me, the kind that makes your hearing go sharp and your muscles tense up like you're about to sprint or fight. I motioned for Vanessa to stay back, and I grabbed this heavy Maglite flashlight we kept by the back door. Not because I needed light, but because it was the closest thing to a weapon I had within reach. As I got closer to that door, maybe 10 feet away, I heard it. Breathing. Not heavy, not labored, just the quiet, rhythmic sound of someone trying very hard to stay still and silent. It was coming from inside that room, and whoever it was wasn't doing a great job of staying quiet, because I could hear this faint whistling sound on the exhale, like their nose was stuffy or they'd been running. My brain was racing through possibilities. Maybe it was a kid who'd gotten scared and was hiding. Maybe it was some homeless person who'd found a way in and was just trying to survive the cold night. Maybe it was someone high on drugs who didn't even know where they were. But then I heard a small mechanical sound, like a phone vibrating on silent mode, and the breathing stopped completely. Whoever was in there had just gotten a message or notification, and they were now aware that we were home, and probably knew we'd heard them. The silence that followed was worse than the breathing, because it meant they were listening for us, just as intently as we were listening for them. Vanessa had moved closer despite my warning, and she was standing maybe 5 feet behind me, her phone already open to the 911 screen, with her thumb hovering over the call button. I could see her face in the glow of her screen. She was pale, her jaw clenched, eyes wide but focused. I remember thinking how crazy it was that we were standing in our own hallway, in our own house, afraid of a door we opened and closed 100 times before. I raised my voice, trying to sound authoritative, but hearing it come out shakier than I wanted, and said something like, "We've already called the police, they're on their way, you need to come out now." Complete bluff, obviously, but I didn't know what else to do. For maybe 10 seconds, nothing happened. Then I heard movement. Not toward the door, but away from it, like shuffling footsteps moving toward the window on the far side of the room. That window. I knew that window didn't open easily because the frame had warped over time, and we'd never bothered to fix it since we didn't use that room anyway, which meant whoever was in there had probably come in through the back door, not the window, and was now trapped unless they wanted to confront us directly. I heard them struggling with the window, the scraping sound of wood against wood as they tried to force it up. Vanessa whispered urgently behind me, "Call them, actually call them right now," and I heard her fingers tapping on her screen. She spoke in this low, controlled voice to the dispatcher, giving our address and saying there was an intruder in our home, still inside. We could hear them. The dispatcher told her to get out of the house immediately, don't engage, wait outside for the officers, but Vanessa just said, "Okay," and didn't move an inch. We both stood there, frozen in this awful moment of decision. Do we run outside and risk them getting away, or do we stay and potentially trap them until the cops arrive? The window finally gave way with this loud crack, and I heard it slide up. I made a split-second choice and rushed to the door, throwing it open and hitting the light switch, flooding the room with that harsh overhead light. What I saw has been burned into my memory ever since. It was a man, probably mid-30s, wearing a stained gray hoodie and jeans that were too big for him, one leg already out the window. He turned and looked directly at me, and his face, God, his face was just so ordinary. Brown hair, patchy stubble, dark circles under his eyes like he hadn't slept in days. He wasn't some masked monster or deranged lunatic. He just looked tired and desperate and caught. Our eyes met for maybe 2 seconds, but it felt longer. And in that moment, I saw something that genuinely unnerved me more than if he'd been aggressive. He looked disappointed, like a kid who'd been caught doing something they knew was wrong. There were more candy wrappers around his feet, and I noticed he'd been sitting in our desk chair, which he'd pulled over to face the door, like he'd been waiting there, eating Halloween candy and just listening to us on the other side. He had a backpack next to the chair, unzipped, and I could see what looked like Vanessa's jewelry box inside, along with my laptop that I'd left on the desk in our bedroom. He didn't say anything, just stared at me for another second, then pulled his other leg through the window and dropped down into our backyard. I heard the thud of him landing, then the sound of him scrambling over our chain-link fence into the alley behind our house. I ran to the window and looked out, but he was already gone, swallowed up by the darkness between houses. My whole body was shaking, not from fear exactly, but from this cocktail of adrenaline and anger and this bizarre relief that he was gone and hadn't hurt us. Vanessa appeared in the doorway, still on the phone with the dispatcher, and she looked into the room and saw the chair positioned like that, facing the door, and I watched her face change. She got it immediately, understood what I'd just understood. He'd been sitting there listening to us, maybe for minutes before we even knew he was there. Maybe he'd heard us come in, heard us talking in the living room, and just sat there in the dark deciding what to do. That thought made me feel violated in a way that the stolen stuff didn't. The police showed up maybe 6 minutes later, which felt like an eternity, but was apparently pretty fast for our area. 2 officers, one older guy who looked like he'd seen everything, and a younger woman who actually seemed really engaged with what we were telling them. They checked the whole house room by room, looked at the window he'd escaped through, examined the back door and the missing light bulb. The older cop, Officer Dennings, told us it was likely someone who'd been watching the house, knew we'd gone out for the evening, and had probably been inside for at least an hour or more based on the amount of candy wrappers. He pointed out that the guy had eaten maybe 20 or 30 pieces, which takes time, and he'd clearly gone through our bedroom since he had my laptop. The younger officer, her name tag said Alvarez, she's the one who asked the question that made everything click into place. How did he get in? Was the back door unlocked when you left? I told her no, absolutely not. I'm obsessive about locking up. She went back to examine the door more carefully with a flashlight, and when she came back, her expression was serious. There's no sign of forced entry, she said. No scratches on the lock, no damage to the frame. Whoever came in had a key. That statement hit me like a punch to the chest. A key. My mind immediately went to all the people who'd had access to our house. The landlord, obviously, and his maintenance guy who'd fixed our water heater last spring. We'd given a spare to Vanessa's sister for emergencies, but she lived 2 hours away, and we'd just seen her the previous weekend. I'd also lent our key to our friend Austin when we went on vacation in July, so he could water our plants and grab our mail, and he'd given it back, or at least I thought he had. Vanessa was going through the same mental checklist, and I could see panic building in her eyes. Officer Alvarez asked us to make a list of everyone who'd ever had a key, even temporarily, and to call our landlord to find out if anyone else had access to the spare keys he kept. The officers took photos of everything, bagged a few of the candy wrappers as evidence in case they caught the guy and needed to place him at the scene, and gave us a case number. Dennings told us bluntly that we needed to change our locks immediately, first thing tomorrow morning, and to seriously consider getting a security system. Before they left, Alvarez mentioned that there'd been a small uptick in break-ins in our neighborhood over the past month, all of them while residents were out, none of them violent, mostly just theft. But she said ours was the first one where the intruder was caught inside and the first where there was no forced entry. That made us special, lucky in the worst possible way. After they left, Vanessa and I didn't sleep that night. We pushed our dresser against the bedroom door, kept every light in the house on, and just sat up talking through every scenario we could think of. Around 3 in the morning, I remembered something that made my skin go cold. When we first moved in 2 years ago, our landlord had mentioned that the previous tenant had left suddenly, something about a bad breakup, and there'd been some confusion about whether all the keys had been returned. At the time, I hadn't thought much of it, but now it felt significant. The next morning, exhausted and paranoid, I called a locksmith before I even had coffee. The guy came out that same day and changed every single lock on the house. Front door, back door, even the side gate. Cost us almost $400, but I didn't care. We also called Vanessa's sister and Austin to verify they still had their keys or had returned them, and both confirmed they did. Austin even drove over that afternoon to physically show me the key, which I'd completely forgotten I'd gotten back from him, and had hung on our key rack. The landlord was harder to reach, but when I finally got him on the phone, he admitted he'd had 6 copies of the house key at one point, and couldn't account for where all of them were now. That was infuriating, but also oddly relieving. At least we had a likely explanation. We never found out who that guy was. The police never caught him, and honestly, I don't think they tried that hard. No one was hurt, nothing irreplaceable was taken since he dropped the backpack when he ran, and they had bigger cases to worry about. Vanessa and I ended up breaking our lease 3 months later and moving to an apartment complex with actual security, cameras in the hallways, the whole deal. We both agreed we couldn't stay in that house, not after knowing someone had sat in our guest room in the dark, eating candy and listening to us live our lives just on the other side of a door. The thing that still bothers me, even now, isn't the theft or even the danger we were potentially in. It's that image of the chair pulled up facing the door, all those wrappers around it, and the realization that he'd been there long enough to get comfortable. He wasn't in a hurry. He wasn't panicked. He was just waiting, and if we'd come home even 30 minutes earlier, or if he'd decided to walk out of that room instead of hiding, I don't know what would have happened. Sometimes I wonder if it really was just a random guy who'd gotten hold of an old key, or if it was the previous tenant who'd never really left us alone. Either way, I check every lock twice now, every single night, and I probably always will. Halloween used to be my favorite holiday. I'm talking full-on obsessed, planning costumes in August, mapping out the best candy routes, the whole deal. I was 14 in October 2015, living with my mom and younger brother in a suburb outside Portland, Oregon. Our street, Oakmont Drive, was one of those picture-perfect neighborhoods where people actually knew each other's names and borrowed lawn equipment. Every house went all out for Halloween. Carved pumpkins, fake cobwebs, those inflatable ghosts that looked ridiculous in daylight. Except for one house. Number 447, about 5 doors down from us. A single-story ranch with faded blue siding, belonging to a guy everyone just called Mr. Henley. He'd lived there longer than anyone could remember, kept to himself, never caused problems. But here's the weird part. Every single Halloween, without fail, he'd decorate his front porch. Not elaborate stuff, just a couple of carved pumpkins, some orange lights, a wreath on the door. Made it look like he was participating. But if you actually walked up those steps and knocked, nothing. Complete silence. The lights would be on inside, you could see the flicker of a TV through the curtains, but he never, ever answered the door. Most kids learned to skip his house after the first year of trying. It became this unspoken thing in the neighborhood. You'd see groups of trick-or-treaters walk right past 447 without even slowing down. But it always bugged me, you know? Why decorate if you're not going to hand out candy? Why make your house look inviting and then ignore everyone? My friend Troy, this scrawny kid with red hair who lived for causing trouble, had this theory that Mr. Henley was doing it on purpose, like some psychological experiment to mess with people. Troy's older brother Dylan was 17, had his license, and thought he was hot shit because he could grow a patchy beard. That October, Dylan decided he was going to teach the old creep a lesson for being antisocial. He recruited Troy, me, and this girl Amber from our grade who had a reputation for being fearless. The plan was simple, stupid teenager stuff. We'd go to Mr. Henley's house on Halloween night, TP his trees, maybe smash a pumpkin, ring the doorbell a bunch of times, and run. Classic prank, nothing crazy. I remember feeling uneasy about it even then, but I didn't want to look like a coward in front of everyone, especially Amber. So I agreed. Halloween night came with that perfect autumn chill in the air. Our neighborhood was packed. Families everywhere, little kids in princess costumes holding their parents' hands, teenagers in lazy last-minute outfits. Dylan picked us up around 8:30 in his beat-up Jeep Cherokee, after most of the young trick-or-treaters had gone home. Troy was practically vibrating with excitement in the passenger seat, kept going on about how this was going to be legendary. Amber sat in the back with me, checking her phone, looking bored but game for whatever. We parked 2 streets over and walked, carrying rolls of toilet paper stuffed in our jacket pockets. The closer we got to Oakmont Drive, the quieter it became. Most porch lights were turning off, the Halloween energy dying down for the night. When we reached Mr. Henley's house, I noticed the decorations looked exactly the same as every other year. 2 jack-o'-lanterns on the porch steps, their triangle eyes glowing from the candles inside, orange string lights outlining the door frame. His living room light was on, and through the sheer curtains, I could see the blue glow of his television. Everything looked normal, peaceful even. That's what made what Dylan said next feel so out of place. "Check it out," Dylan whispered, pointing to the roof edge above the porch. At first, I didn't see what he meant. Then Amber spotted it too. A small black object mounted under the eave, angled down toward the walkway. "Is that a camera?" she asked. We all stared at it for a second. It was definitely a camera, one of those compact security ones, and it was pointed directly at the sidewalk and front path. "Paranoid old bastard," Dylan muttered, but he was grinning like it made the whole thing more exciting. Troy suggested we do the prank from the side yard instead, away from the camera's view. We crept around to the right side of the house, where a tall wooden fence separated Mr. Henley's property from his neighbors. The area was darker here, just a small side window with the blinds drawn and a motion sensor light that thankfully didn't trigger. Dylan started unrolling toilet paper, getting ready to toss it over the fence into the front yard trees. That's when Troy noticed something that made him grab my arm hard enough to hurt. "Dude," he hissed, "there's another one." He was pointing at the corner of the house near the foundation. Another camera, smaller than the first, tucked into the shadow where the siding met the concrete. This one was aimed along the side of the house, covering the exact area where we were standing. My stomach twisted. Why would someone need cameras on the side of their house? Dylan tried to play it cool, said lots of people have security systems, but his voice had lost that cocky edge. Amber wanted to leave. She kept saying this was creepy and we should just go, but Troy, stubborn as always, said we'd come this far and weren't going to chicken out over some cameras. He started moving toward the back of the house, staying close to the wall, and like idiots, we followed. The backyard was small and enclosed by that same wooden fence, with a concrete patio and a rusted barbecue grill that looked like it hadn't been used in years. A sliding glass door led into what I assumed was the kitchen, and next to it was a regular door with a small window at the top. Everything was dark back there except for one thing. Mounted on the back corner of the house, pointed at the yard, was a third camera, and this one had a little red light blinking on it. Troy saw it the same time I did. Nobody said anything for a moment. We just stood there in this guy's backyard, realizing that every single angle of his property was being recorded. That's when Dylan, trying to salvage his tough guy image, did the dumbest thing possible. He walked right up to the back door and knocked. Loud. The sound echoed in the quiet night. We all tensed up, waiting for Mr. Henley to flip on the porch light or yell at us to get lost. But nothing happened. Dylan knocked again, harder this time, the kind of aggressive banging that would wake up anyone inside. Still nothing. "He's definitely home," Amber whispered, pointing at the TV light still visible through the front windows. We could even hear it faintly, the muffled sound of voices from whatever show was playing. Dylan tried the door handle, locked, obviously. Then he cupped his hands around his face and peered through the small window at the top of the door. He went completely still. "What?" Troy asked. "What do you see?" Dylan didn't answer right away. When he finally stepped back, his face looked pale even in the darkness. "There's papers," he said quietly. "Like, everywhere, covering the walls." Before anyone could process that, Troy shoved past him and looked through the window himself. "Holy shit," he breathed. "It's all printouts. Photos, I think." I didn't want to look. Every instinct was screaming at me to get out of there, to go home. Forget this whole stupid night. But curiosity is a terrible thing. I stepped up and pressed my face to the cold glass. The kitchen was dim, lit only by the glow spilling in from another room, but I could see enough. The walls were absolutely plastered with printed photographs, hundreds of them, maybe thousands, overlapping each other like scales on a fish. They covered every visible surface, taped up in this obsessive collage that made my brain hurt to look at. From what I could make out, they were pictures of the street. Our street, different times of day, different seasons. I recognized Mrs. Palmer's garden from last spring, the Johnsons' car that they'd sold months ago, and people. Kids walking to the bus stop, parents pushing strollers, teenagers on bikes, all taken from a distance like surveillance photos. My eyes landed on one image that was closer than the others, clearer. It showed 3 kids in Halloween costumes from what looked like last year, a vampire, a witch, and a skeleton. They were walking right past Mr. Henley's house, probably on their way to better candy spots. The photo was zoomed in enough that you could see their faces clearly. I recognized the vampire. It was Troy's little sister, Kayla. She'd been 9 last Halloween. "We need to call the cops," Amber said, and her voice was shaking now. She had her phone out already, but before she could dial, we heard it. A sound from inside the house. Not footsteps exactly, more like something being dragged across the floor, heavy and slow. We all backed away from the door at the same time. Troy grabbed Dylan's arm and started pulling him toward the side of the house, toward the way we'd come in. That's when I noticed Dylan was staring at something. "Where's Troy?" he said. It took a second for the words to make sense. I turned around. Troy was right there next to Dylan. He'd just been pulling on his arm. But Dylan wasn't looking at Troy. He was looking past us, at the back fence. "Not Troy," Dylan said, his voice weird and flat. "The other kid, the one who was just standing by the grill." Ice flooded my veins. There had been 4 of us, me, Dylan, Troy, and Amber. Nobody else. "What are you talking about?" Amber demanded. But she was looking around now too, her phone's flashlight swinging wildly. Dylan insisted he'd seen someone, a shorter figure in dark clothes, standing by the barbecue grill when we were all looking through the window. He'd assumed it was one of us who'd wandered off. We tore out of that backyard like our lives depended on it. I slammed my shin against the corner of the fence gate so hard I saw stars, but I didn't stop running. We didn't stop until we reached Dylan's Jeep 2 streets away, all of us gasping for air, checking and rechecking that it was just the 4 of us. Dylan kept insisting he'd seen someone, describing a person maybe 5 feet tall, wearing a dark hoodie. Troy called him paranoid, said it was just shadows and he'd freaked himself out. But I'd seen Dylan's face in that moment. He wasn't the type to scare easy, and he'd looked genuinely confused, like his brain couldn't make sense of what his eyes had seen. We sat in the Jeep for almost 20 minutes arguing about what to do. Amber wanted to call the police immediately and tell them about the cameras and the photos. Troy was worried we'd get in trouble for trespassing. Dylan had gone quiet, just gripping the steering wheel and staring out the windshield. Finally, I convinced them we should at least tell our parents. Let them handle it like adults. We agreed to go home, and tomorrow we'd figure out the right way to report what we'd seen. Dylan dropped everyone off. When I got home, my mom was watching TV in the living room. I almost told her everything right then, but the words stuck in my throat. How do you explain that you were trying to vandalize someone's house and discovered something way worse? I barely slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those photos layered on top of each other, all those unsuspecting people going about their lives while being documented. The next morning, a Wednesday, my mom woke me up early. Her face was serious in a way that made my chest tighten. "Did you see Troy last night?" she asked. I told her yeah, we'd all hung out for Halloween. She sat down on my bed and took a breath. "His mom just called. He never came home last night." The room started spinning. I told her that couldn't be right. Dylan had dropped Troy off at his house around 10:30, same as the rest of us. My mom said Troy's mom had been up waiting, and he never walked through the door. His phone was going straight to voicemail. They'd already called the police. I got dressed in a blur, and my mom drove me to Troy's house, where there were already 2 police cars parked outside. Troy's parents looked destroyed, his mom crying on the porch while his dad talked to the officers. They asked me questions. When did I last see him? Did he mention going anywhere else? Did he seem upset or different? I told them everything I could without mentioning where we'd actually been. Said we were just walking around the neighborhood. One of the officers wrote everything down in a little notepad, his face professionally neutral, asking if Troy had any problems at home or school, the standard runaway questions. By that afternoon, I couldn't take it anymore. I called Amber and told her we needed to tell someone about Mr. Henley's house, about what we'd seen. She'd been thinking the same thing. We decided to tell her older sister, who was 22 and worked as a paralegal, someone who'd know how to handle it properly. When we explained everything to her, showing her exactly where the house was on Oakmont Drive, her expression turned grim. She didn't yell at us for trespassing. She just made us repeat every detail twice, then immediately called a detective hotline she had saved in her phone from her work. Within an hour, there were 6 police cars on our street. I watched from my bedroom window as officers surrounded Mr. Henley's house, knocking on the door with that official police knock. When he didn't answer, they went around back. I couldn't see what happened next, but within 30 minutes, they were bringing Mr. Henley out in handcuffs. He was smaller than I'd imagined, balding, wearing a cardigan that made him look like somebody's retired grandfather. He wasn't fighting or yelling. He just looked resigned, like he'd been expecting this day to come eventually. More police showed up. They started carrying boxes out of the house. Computer equipment, hard drives, file folders. The whole street came out to watch. Nobody could believe it. Mr. Henley, the quiet neighbor who kept to himself, was being arrested right in front of everyone. The full story came out over the next few days, pieced together from news reports and neighborhood gossip. Police found over 30 cameras hidden around Mr. Henley's property and inside his house, all pointed at the street and sidewalks. His computer contained thousands upon thousands of photos and videos of children from the neighborhood, organized into folders by name, age, and physical description. He'd been doing this for at least 8 years, maybe longer. The cameras had motion sensors. They'd activate whenever someone walked by. He had footage of kids waiting for the school bus, playing in yards, riding bikes. Nothing explicitly illegal in terms of the footage itself, since it was all taken from his property of public spaces. But the scope and obsessive nature of the collection was enough for charges related to stalking and endangering minors. They found detailed notes about routines, favorite colors, names of friends. It was a surveillance operation that would have made intelligence agencies jealous. But here's the thing that still haunts me. They found Troy. Not at Mr. Henley's house, and that's what made it so much worse in a way. Troy had apparently panicked after Dylan dropped him off. Couldn't stop thinking about those photos and that figure Dylan claimed to see. Instead of going inside his house, he'd walked back to Oakmont Drive by himself, planning to watch Mr. Henley's house from a distance to see if anything suspicious happened. A neighbor 2 doors down from Mr. Henley had a security camera, and it caught Troy standing across the street around 11 p.m. just watching the house. What the camera also caught, about 15 minutes later, was a van pulling up. Not Mr. Henley's vehicle, something else entirely. A white contractor van with no plates visible. 2 men got out. They walked straight toward Troy. The footage was grainy and taken from an angle, but you could see Troy backing away, then the men moving faster, and then Troy was just gone. The van drove off. Police traced the van through other neighborhood cameras and traffic footage. It led them to a house in Vancouver, Washington, about 20 miles away. What they found there was worse than anything at Mr. Henley's place. Turns out Mr. Henley wasn't working alone. He was part of a network, and his role was surveillance, identifying targets, documenting patterns, providing information to others who did the actual abductions. The house in Vancouver was where they brought the kids. I can't write the details of what happened in that place. I still have nightmares about what the news reports implied. They found Troy there, along with 2 other children who'd been missing from different counties. Troy had been there less than 24 hours when police raided the location. He was physically okay, traumatized beyond belief, but alive. The timing of our discovery and report had literally saved his life. If we'd waited even one more day to tell someone, the outcome would have been different. 7 people were arrested in total, including Mr. Henley. The trial was massive, made national news for a while. Mr. Henley took a plea deal and got 40 years. The others got more. Troy moved away with his family about 6 months later. Couldn't handle living on that street anymore, knowing that his every movement had been cataloged for years by someone living 5 houses down. I don't blame him. I moved away too for college and never went back except to visit my mom. She sold that house in 2023. Sometimes I think about how many times I walked past Mr. Henley's place as a kid, completely oblivious. How many times I was photographed, filed away, studied. The police said we were lucky that Mr. Henley's role was just observation, that he personally never hurt anyone, just enabled others to do so. But that doesn't make it better. He sat in that house for years, watching children, knowing exactly what his information would be used for. The decorations on Halloween were bait, a test to see which kids would come to his door, get close enough for clear facial shots. That's why he never answered. He didn't want candy-seeking trick-or-treaters. He wanted footage. The figure Dylan saw in the backyard that night, police think it might have been one of Mr. Henley's associates, checking on something, maybe even watching us while we discovered the cameras. We'll never know for sure, and honestly, I don't want to know. What I do know is that Halloween will never feel the same. Every decorated house, every porch light, every neighbor I don't quite recognize, it all carries this weight now. Trust is a fragile thing. Sometimes the monsters don't hide in the shadows. Sometimes they live 5 doors down and wave politely when you check the mail. November 1st, 2023 started like any other morning after Halloween, except I couldn't stop thinking about what happened the night before. I'm 17, a senior at Lincoln High in Pennsylvania, and I'd been looking forward to having the house to myself for once. Mom and Dad had this wedding to go to in Philadelphia, some second cousin I'd never met, and they'd be gone until late. They kept asking if I wanted them to stay, if I'd be okay alone on Halloween night. But honestly, I was thrilled. No parents meant I could game with my buddies online, order whatever food I wanted, and not deal with handing out candy to screaming kids all night. I'd been working part-time at Best Buy after school, saving up for a car, and I was exhausted. A quiet night in sounded perfect. Our neighborhood in Harrisburg wasn't exactly the trick-or-treating capital anyway. Most families drove their kids to the newer developments where the houses were closer together. We lived on Belmont Road, where the properties had these long driveways and the houses sat far back from the street. Perfect for privacy, perfect for what I thought would be a peaceful evening. Around 7:30, just as it was getting dark, the first knock came. I was in the middle of a raid in Destiny 2, headset on, completely zoned into the game. The knock was loud enough that I heard it through my headphones, which annoyed me because I was about to take down a boss. I muted my mic and yelled, "We're not doing candy this year," toward the front door, not even bothering to get up. My character died because I wasn't paying attention, and I cursed under my breath. The knocking came again, harder this time, more insistent. I pulled off my headset and actually listened. It was this weird rhythm, 3 quick knocks, pause, 2 slow ones. Not the usual excited kid knock. Something about it felt deliberate, almost like a code. I pushed back from my desk in the living room where I'd set up my gaming station and walked to the front hallway. Our house has this long entrance with the door at the end, and there's a small window beside it. But the porch light was off because, well, We weren't participating. Through the frosted glass panel, I could see shapes, 2, maybe 3 people standing there. They were wearing masks, looked like adults based on their height. I figured maybe older kids, high schoolers trying to score free candy. I didn't open the door. Instead, I called out through it, "Sorry, we're not handing out candy tonight." My voice came out stronger than I felt, trying to sound authoritative like my dad does when he wants solicitors to leave. There was this long pause, maybe 10 seconds of complete silence, and I thought they'd left. Then I heard it. A woman's voice, muffled through the door, sweet and friendly. "Oh, we're not trick-or-treating, honey. We're from the house across the street, the Buchanans. We're collecting donations for the community center's Halloween fund. Just a few dollars if you can spare it." I didn't know anyone named Buchanan, and I'd lived here my whole life. The house directly across from ours had been empty for 3 months since old Mr. Garrett died. His kids were still fighting over the estate or something. My mom had mentioned it. I stood there, hand on the doorknob, feeling this weird tension in my chest. The smart thing would have been to just say no thanks and walk away. But I felt rude, you know? Like maybe they were new neighbors I hadn't met yet, and I didn't want to be that jerk teenager who slammed the door on people trying to do something nice for the community. I don't really have any cash on me," I said through the door, which was true. I had maybe $6 in my wallet upstairs. "Maybe you could come back when my parents are home?" The woman's voice came again, and this time something about it sounded different, less friendly, more practiced, like she was reading from a script. "That's okay, sweetie. Do you have Venmo? We can do it digitally. Or we're also just passing out these flyers about the event. Could you just open the door real quick so I can hand you one?" Every instinct I had suddenly screamed no. My girlfriend Veronica, we'd been dating for 8 months. She was always joking about how I was too trusting, how I'd probably let a serial killer in if they asked politely enough. I remembered her saying that, and actually took a step back from the door. "You know what? I'm actually not supposed to open the door when my parents aren't home," I said, trying to keep my voice casual. "But thanks anyway." The silence that followed was heavy, uncomfortable. I could see the shapes through the frosted glass, and they weren't moving, just standing there. Then came that same knock pattern again, 3 quick, 2 slow, but harder this time, almost aggressive. The whole door shook with it. My heart started pounding in a way that made my ears ring. I backed up further into the hallway, putting more distance between me and that door. "I really can't help you tonight," I shouted, my voice cracking a bit on the last word. I hated how scared I sounded. Through the window, I watched the shapes finally move. They turned away from the door, and I could see them walking down our porch steps. Relief flooded through me so fast I actually felt dizzy. See? Just persistent fundraisers or whatever. Annoying but harmless. I laughed at myself a little, feeling stupid for getting so worked up. I went back to my gaming setup, put my headset back on, and rejoined my buddies in the chat. "Dude, where'd you go?" my friend Carlos asked. "Had some weirdos at the door," I said, trying to sound casual about it. "Halloween brings out all the crazies." We played for another hour, and I'd mostly forgotten about the whole thing. Around 9 o'clock, I ordered a pizza, pepperoni and jalapeno, something Mom would never let me get because she says it's too greasy. I was paying online when I heard it again. That knock. 3 quick, 2 slow. I ripped off my headset so fast it clattered onto my desk. The knocking continued, patient and rhythmic, like whoever was out there had all the time in the world. This time I was angry more than scared. What part of no did these people not understand? I marched to the front door, ready to be way less polite, and looked through the peephole we had installed up high. 3 people stood on my porch, all wearing those cheap rubber masks you get at Spirit Halloween, a werewolf, a zombie, and what looked like a screaming ghost face. They were all facing the door, perfectly still, like they were posing for a photo. All 3 were definitely adults, broad shoulders, tall, wearing dark clothes that weren't costumes. Something about the way they stood there, not fidgeting or talking to each other, made my anger evaporate instantly. Normal people don't stand that still. "We're still collecting for the community center." The woman's voice came again, but this time she wasn't even trying to sound friendly. It was flat, almost bored. "We know you're alone in there. Your parents won't be back until late." My entire body went rigid. How did they know that? How did they know my parents were gone? I definitely hadn't told them that detail. I stepped away from the door as quietly as possible, my socks silent on the hardwood floor. My phone was still on my desk in the living room. I needed to call 911 or my parents or someone. But as I turned to head back, I heard something that made me stop breathing. Footsteps, not on the porch. These were moving around the side of the house. Deliberate, crunching through the leaves my dad had been too lazy to rake last weekend. They were circling the house. I crept toward the living room window that faced our driveway and carefully pulled back just the edge of the curtain. The werewolf mask was peering into my dad's office window on the side of the house, hands cupped around the face to see inside better. The person was trying the window, jiggling it gently to test if it was locked. My dad was paranoid about that stuff. But watching someone actually try to break into your house while you're inside is a completely different level of terror than anything I'd ever experienced. My legs felt weak, like they might just give out. I let the curtain fall back and basically crawled to my desk, grabbed my phone with shaking fingers, and dialed 911. 911, what's your emergency? The dispatcher's voice was calm, professional, and hearing another human voice almost made me cry with relief. "There are people trying to break into my house," I whispered, crouching down behind my desk like that would somehow protect me. "I'm home alone, and they keep knocking, and now they're checking the windows." The dispatcher asked for my address and I gave it, my voice barely above a whisper. "Are they armed? Can you see weapons?" she asked. I hadn't even thought to check for weapons. The idea made my throat close up. "I don't know. They're wearing masks, Halloween masks. There's 3 of them, maybe more." She told me to stay on the line, that officers were being dispatched and were about 8 minutes away. 8 minutes. That felt like an eternity. She kept talking to me, asking questions. Was I in a room with a lock? Did I know these people? Had they said anything threatening? I answered automatically, my brain only half processing what I was saying. The knocking had stopped. That somehow felt worse than when they were pounding on the door. At least then I knew where they were. Now the house was completely silent except for my ragged breathing and the tinny sound of the dispatcher's voice. Then I heard it, a scraping sound, metal on metal, coming from the back of the house, the kitchen door. We had this old sliding glass door that led to our deck, and the lock on it had always been kind of loose. "They're trying to get in through the back," I hissed into the phone, scrambling to my feet. The dispatcher's voice got more urgent. "Is there a room you can lock yourself in? Preferably with only one entry point?" My parents' bedroom had a lock on the door and it was upstairs, away from both entry points. I ran for the stairs, taking them 2 at a time, my heart hammering so hard I thought it might actually burst. Behind me, I heard glass breaking, not shattering, but that distinct crack of glass giving way, followed by the screech of the sliding door being forced open on its track. They were inside. They were actually inside my house. I got to my parents' room, slammed the door shut, and turned the lock. It was one of those flimsy privacy locks, not a deadbolt, the kind a decent kick could probably break through. I pushed their heavy dresser in front of the door, adrenaline making me strong enough to move it by myself, even though it usually took both my parents. The dispatcher was still talking, telling me the police were 6 minutes out, telling me to stay quiet, to stay hidden. I could hear voices downstairs now, casual conversation like they were guests at a party, male voices discussing something I couldn't make out. What happened next still makes me sick to think about. I heard footsteps moving through our house, not rushing, not searching frantically, but methodical. Drawers opening and closing in my dad's office. The sound of our TV being unplugged, I recognized that specific pop the speakers made. They were robbing us. Just casually looting our home while I hid upstairs like a scared kid. I heard one of them laugh at something, this normal, everyday laugh that made the whole thing feel surreal. How could someone break into a house, knowing someone was home, and just laugh about it? Then the footsteps started coming up the stairs, slow, deliberate steps on our creaky staircase. I pressed myself against the far wall of my parents' room, clutching my phone so tight my knuckles ached. The dispatcher was whispering now, as if they could somehow hear her through my phone. "Police are 3 minutes away. Stay absolutely quiet. Don't engage with them." One of them tried the handle of the guest bathroom. Then my bedroom door. I heard it swing open, heard someone walking around in there. My gaming setup that I'd spent months saving for. My laptop. My collection of vintage band posters that Veronica had gotten me for my birthday. They were trashing my space, going through my stuff. Finally, footsteps stopped right outside my parents' door. The handle jiggled, once, twice. Then a man's voice, calm and almost friendly. "Hey kid, we know you called the cops. They're not gonna get here in time. Just stay in there and keep quiet and nobody gets hurt. We're just here for the valuables." I couldn't even respond. My throat had completely closed up. I just stood there, pressed against the wall, praying that dresser would hold if they decided to force the door. But they didn't. After a few seconds of silence, I heard them move away, back down the stairs. More sounds of things being moved, collected. A crash that sounded like our china cabinet in the dining room. Mom's grandmother's dishes that she only brought out for Thanksgiving. I wanted to scream at them, tell them to leave that alone, but I bit down on my own hand to stay silent. The dispatcher kept whispering encouragement, telling me I was doing great. That help was almost there. Then, like someone had flipped a switch, I heard rapid movement downstairs. Footsteps running toward the back of the house, car doors slamming outside, an engine starting. They were leaving. Through my parents' window, I saw a dark van, one of those old cargo vans with no windows in the back, peeling out of our driveway so fast the tires squealed. Maybe 30 seconds later, I heard the most beautiful sound of my life. Sirens. Multiple sirens getting closer. Red and blue lights flashed through the window, painting the walls of the bedroom in alternating colors. The police found me still barricaded in my parents' room, still on the phone with dispatch, shaking so badly I could barely push the dresser away from the door to let them in. There were 4 officers, and they cleared the whole house before they'd let me come out. The place was destroyed. They'd taken our TV, my dad's expensive camera equipment, Mom's jewelry box from their bedroom, my gaming laptop, even the spare car keys we kept in the kitchen drawer. The sliding glass door was completely shattered, glass everywhere across the kitchen floor. But what really got me was the front door. It was standing wide open, swinging slightly in the night breeze. They'd unlocked it from the inside and left it open, like they were making a point. Like they wanted me to know how easy it had been. One of the officers, this older guy with gray in his beard named Officer Paulson, sat with me on the couch while they processed the scene. He explained that there'd been a string of burglaries in surrounding neighborhoods over the past 2 months, all on Halloween night. Groups of 2 to 4 adults, dressed like trick-or-treaters or fundraisers, would knock on doors to see if anyone was home. If someone answered, they'd make an excuse and leave. If no one answered, or if they could tell it was just a kid home alone, they'd force entry. They'd hit 6 houses that night alone before getting to ours. I was the first person who'd actually called the cops while they were still inside. My parents got home around 11, while the police were still there taking statements and dusting for fingerprints. Mom completely broke down when she saw the house, and Dad just kept hugging me saying, "You did everything right, you did everything right," over and over. The weird thing is, they caught the group 2 weeks later. Turned out they were operating out of a rental property in Mechanicsburg, about 20 minutes away. 4 people total, 3 men and 1 woman, all in their 30s and 40s, all with prior records. They'd been doing this for years, apparently, moving from state to state and hitting suburbs during holidays when people were distracted and homes were empty. The cops recovered some of our stuff from a storage unit they'd rented, though my laptop was already sold. The thing that still messes with me isn't even the robbery itself, it's how normal they sounded. That casual laugh, the friendly voice at the door, the guy calmly telling me to stay quiet. They'd done this so many times it was just routine for them, like they were working a regular job. Sometimes I still hear that knock pattern in my head. 3 quick, 2 slow, and my whole body tenses up. We moved to a different house 6 months later. Mom and Dad said it was because they wanted to downsize, but I know the real reason. None of us could feel safe there anymore. I still can't stay home alone at night, even now. Veronica thinks I should talk to someone about it, and she's probably right. But honestly, posting this here helps. Just getting it out there, you know. If you're ever home alone and something feels wrong, trust that feeling. Don't worry about being rude or paranoid. Just lock the doors, call the cops, and don't open that door for anyone. People always talk about Halloween like it's harmless. Costumes, candy, and too much sugar before bedtime. That night started exactly like that for me and my best friend Lucas. We were both 13, still trying to pretend we weren't too old to go door to door. Our neighborhood in Cedar Hills was calm, all trimmed lawns and pumpkin lights. My mom had given us one rule before we left. Only wrapped candy, okay? Of course, we nodded and ignored it the second we were out of sight. We'd been walking for maybe an hour when we noticed a porch that looked different. No plastic skeletons, no lights. Just a single orange candle flickering on a wooden table by the door. An old woman stepped out as we got close. She had snow-white hair tied in a bun and wore a knitted shawl with tiny black cats embroidered along the edges. "Evening, boys," she said with this soft, tired voice. "You're my first trick-or-treaters tonight." She smiled and handed us small foil-wrapped brownies, still warm. "Homemade," she added proudly. Lucas grinned and said thank you before I could even think twice. We didn't open them right away. The foil was a little greasy, and they smelled like cinnamon and cocoa. It felt almost too personal, like something your grandma would give you, not a stranger. Lucas said his aunt used to bake brownies like that, and he tore his open, took a bite, and laughed. "See? Perfectly fine." I remember hesitating, the warmth seeping through the foil into my palm. I told myself it would be rude not to at least try. So I ate half of mine while we kept walking toward the next house. About 2 hours later, I started feeling heavy, like every step was through mud. Lucas joked that maybe we'd just eaten too much candy, but his words slurred a little. I remember standing in front of a house with inflatable ghosts when the world tilted sideways. The lights stretched, the sounds of kids laughing faded, and I couldn't tell if I was still standing or on the ground. I heard Lucas mumbling something, but it sounded far away, like underwater. After that, everything went black. When I came to, I was lying on my bedroom floor. My mom was hovering over me, panicked, holding the phone to her ear. My mouth was dry and I could barely keep my eyes open. She said she'd found me collapsed near the front door when she got back from her shift. I tried to ask about Lucas, but my voice barely came out. She didn't even realize I'd gone out trick-or-treating alone. She thought he was home by then. That's when I saw the crumpled piece of foil on the floor beside me, and it hit me like a puzzle snapping together. The next morning, my mom told me Lucas had been taken to the hospital. His parents found him unconscious too in his driveway. The doctors said we were lucky. Whatever we'd eaten had been dosed with a strong sedative. Police came to ask questions, and I remember sitting on the couch trying to recall every detail about that woman's house. The candle, the shawl with the cats, the way she'd said, "You're my first trick-or-treaters tonight." I told them everything I could think of, but the more I talked, the more it felt like the edges of that memory were smudged. 2 officers drove around the block with my mom and me that afternoon. Every house looked normal. Plastic pumpkins, fake cobwebs, all the usual stuff. But when we got to the spot where I swore the old lady's house had been, there was nothing. Just an empty lot with overgrown weeds and a "for sale" sign half buried in dirt. The officer asked if I was sure, and I pointed to where the candle had been, the porch steps, everything. He just looked at me like he didn't want to say what he was thinking. That night, I couldn't sleep. My head throbbed. and I kept replaying the moment she handed us the brownies. I could still smell them, warm chocolate and cinnamon. I could even hear the faint clink of her bracelets as she moved. Around midnight, I heard footsteps outside my window. Slow, deliberate, crunching through leaves. I told myself it was a raccoon, but the steps stopped right beneath my window, and a shadow passed across the curtain. Tall but hunched. I waited, holding my breath, until it moved away toward the street. The following morning, police cars were parked down the street again. They'd found something behind the empty lot, a cellar entrance hidden beneath rotted boards. Inside, there were shelves stacked with baking ingredients, dozens of foil-wrapped brownies, and children's costumes. One of the detectives told my mom quietly that there were also blankets, a lantern, and a small radio tuned to static. No one lived there, not anymore. The house had burned down years earlier after a gas leak. That lot had been empty ever since. When they showed me photos from the cellar, one detail hit me hard. On one of the shelves was a folded shawl with embroidered black cats, exactly like the one the woman wore. The detective said they were still testing fingerprints, but his expression told me they didn't expect to find anything living down there. Lucas and I were told we'd probably ingested just enough to knock us out, not enough to kill us. Whoever or whatever that woman was, she'd planned for a much longer night. A week later, the neighborhood was back to normal. Decorations came down, kids were back in school, and adults talked about it like some urban legend that had gotten out of hand. But I couldn't walk past that lot without feeling a chill. The candle table was gone, but the grass where it once stood never grew back. It stayed like a dark patch in the dirt, perfectly round, as if scorched. Every time I saw it, I swore I could smell that same mix of chocolate and cinnamon lingering in the air. It's been years now, and Halloween still makes me uneasy. I don't touch anything homemade, not even from people I trust. Sometimes, when the porch lights start flickering at night, I remember her voice, soft, almost motherly, telling us we were her first trick-or-treaters. My mom says trauma can play tricks on memory, that maybe I misremembered parts of that night. But I know what I saw. I know what I tasted. And I know that somewhere out there, someone else might still be handing out those same warm, foil-wrapped brownies.